Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Valeria Vivano. Valeria Fern Vivano was born on May 29, 1996, in La Granja, a small commune near Santiago, Chile's capital. She was the youngest of 3 children in a modest family, with her parents Miguel and Jacqueline Vivano. She grew up with her older brother Michelangelo and sister Daniela. Her father worked for a transportation company, while her mother stayed at home to care for the children and create a warm family atmosphere. When Valeria started school, her parents decided to separate, which was a huge shock for her. Even though they continued to communicate after the divorce and her father is still very interested in his children's lives, including providing financial support, Valeria felt resentment towards him. They sometimes argued and went months without speaking, but they always managed to reconcile. Soon after the divorce, Miguel remarried, and Valeria gained 2 half-siblings. She maintained warm family relationships with them, as well as with her siblings, Daniela and Michelangelo. Jacqueline, on the other hand, never remarried. She focused on raising her children and later took care of her grandchildren. From a young age, Valeria showed a strong character, determination, and remarkable perseverance in everything she did. She excelled academically, participated in sports, and was always brave and fair, willing to help others, even when it put her at risk. She pursued a career in law enforcement because of her desire to help people in need and fight for justice. After finishing high school, Valeria enrolled in a police academy in Santiago, where she graduated with honors in 2016, becoming an investigator. At just 20 years old, she joined the Chilean police force. The following year, she started working in the bureau that investigates serious crimes in the capital. From the very beginning, Valeria demonstrated her commitment as a law enforcement officer and her passion for justice. She loved her job, carried out her responsibilities with care, and was always ready to respond to emergencies, even in the middle of the night. She would rush to crime scenes, pursue criminals, and sometimes had to provide emotional support to people who had lost loved ones. Her colleagues described Valeria as kind, cheerful, and friendly, while also recognizing her as a true professional and a dependable partner. Valeria served in the police force for nearly 5.5 years, during which she received numerous awards and recognition. She advanced in her career, gaining the respect of her colleagues and the admiration of her superiors. She also represented her department in Spain, spending about 2 weeks in Madrid on an official visit. She took great pride in being entrusted with such significant responsibilities. By 2020, she had been promoted to assistant inspector. In January 2020, Valeria welcomed a new member to her precinct, 21 years old Lionel Alejandro Contreras Canales, who had just graduated from the police academy. Valeria took on the role of his mentor as he started his first job. A few months later, they became partners and initially got along well. Lionel comes from a wealthy and powerful family, with an uncle who is a high-ranking official. Having grown up in comfort and always getting what he wanted, because of this, he became quite selfish and believed that everything should go his way. Valeria noticed her new colleague, Lionel, who repeatedly tried to get her attention and asked her out several times. Each time, she firmly rejected him. Valeria was serious about her job and believed that workplace romances were inappropriate. She viewed Lionel as immature, not because he was 3 years younger, but due to his childish behavior. Despite this, she hoped to help him grow up. In July 2020, Valeria and Lionel attempted to catch robbers who had stolen money from a store's cash register. The criminals remained at the scene and opened fire, leading to a shootout in which Lionel fatally shot both of them. While this situation could have been avoided, Lionel's response was considered appropriate for apprehending the suspects. Nonetheless, this incident put a strain on the relationship between Valeria and Lionel. Valeria's last birthday celebration was on May 29, 2021, when she turned 25. The event took place at her mother's house and was attended by many guests, including family, friends, and co-workers. However, Lionel was not invited. Valeria decided not to invite his, as he had recently tried to pursue her again, and she wanted to avoid any awkwardness. When Valeria attempted to discuss with him, he only reiterated his feelings for her, which she preferred to keep private from her colleagues. Despite the big turnout, presents, warm wishes, and heartfelt congratulations, Valeria appeared upset, even as she tried to smile. She had recently argued with her father and they hadn't spoken in days. Valeria had hoped her father would come to her birthday, but instead, he only sent a brief congratulatory message and didn't even call. Jacqueline, her mother, recognized her daughter's unhappiness and understood the cause of her sorrow. Frustrated with her ex-husband's behavior, she believed he would eventually reach out to Valeria and they would resolve their differences, as they had in the past. Tragically, Valeria and her father never had the opportunity to speak again. Just 2 weeks later, on June 13, 2021, Valeria lost her life while on duty. She was working the night shift, patrolling the streets and checking vehicles as part of a manhunt for a suspect in connection with a crime against a young woman that occurred yesterday on the outskirts of the capital. Authorities were on high alert for a white Kia, suspected to be driven by one of the criminals. The suspect likely had a weapon and may not have been alone in the vehicle. Valeria was in a patrol car with her partner, Lionel, and they were being driven by Deputy Commissioner Felipe Gilardo. They spotted the suspect's vehicle and decided to chase it without waiting for backup. The officers successfully blocked the suspect's escape. Lionel and Vivano got out of their car with their guns drawn, ordering the suspects to surrender and exit their vehicle with their hands raised. Suddenly, a single gunshot was heard, leaving everyone confused about who had fired and from where. Valeria, holding her side, collapsed onto the asphalt next to the police car. Reinforcements arrived at that moment, and Valeria's colleagues heard the gunshot and saw she was injured, but they didn't fully understand what had happened or who had shot her. Taking advantage of the chaos, the criminals quickly fled the scene while first aid was being given to the wounded officer. Despite the swift arrival of medics and the efforts of her colleagues to control the bleeding, Valeria could not be saved. She was rushed to the nearest hospital, where top specialists worked hard to save her life for several hours. Unfortunately, due to severe blood loss and damage to vital parts, she passed away on the operating table without regaining consciousness. When Valeria's family received the news, her parents, brothers, and sisters quickly went to the hospital. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived, had already passed away. Miguel was not only heartbroken but completely shattered, as he never had the chance to talk to and make amends with his dear daughter after their last small argument. He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and was so distressed by the tragedy that he needed medical help to avoid a heart attack. Valeria was officially reported to have died while on duty during an operation aimed at capturing dangerous criminals. She was celebrated as a hero who sacrificed her life for the safety and well-being of others. Local media extensively covered the incident, with reporters highlighting her bravery and selflessness. The investigation into her death was conducted by experts from the Homicide and Major Crimes Division, where Valeria had previously served. They determined that she died from a gunshot wound to the abdomen, inflicted by an assailant in the direction of the suspect's vehicle that she and her colleagues were chasing. The situation initially seemed straightforward, as witnesses supported the narrative, making it appear that the case had been resolved. The only task left was to locate and hold the offenders accountable, who were still at large and possibly fleeing. Shortly after, the suspects were caught, attracting significant public attention. The criminals were identified as 19-year-old Miguel Alejandro Capon and his 17-year-old accomplice, whose name was kept confidential due to his age. Both individuals had prior convictions for lesser crimes. The then president of Chile, Miguel Juan Sebastián Pinera, issued an official statement assuring the public that the perpetrators would face justice according to the law. However, nothing felt off. After the autopsy and necessary examinations, Valeria's body was returned to her family, who gave her a respectful burial in one of the city's cemeteries. Hundreds attended the funeral to pay their respects and offer condolences to her family. Jacqueline and Miguel described the entire experience as a nightmare. Among those who carried Valeria's coffin was her colleague Lionel, who seemed to grieve more than anyone else. However, other colleagues noted there had recently been some tension between them, to the point that Valeria hadn't invited Lionel to her birthday party. Shortly after the funeral, court proceedings began for the suspects who had been arrested the day after the incident and were currently in custody. Everyone believes that the person responsible for Valeria's death has been caught, and proving their guilt seems simple, especially when they begin to give confessions. However, it soon became apparent that the investigation had serious flaws from the beginning. Important details were missed, and crucial forensic evidence was minimized. The process was mismanaged, and higher officials tried to hide the identity of the actual person responsible for Valeria's death. About a month and a half after Valeria's death, the case took an unexpected turn. By the end of July, 2 employees were suspended for their alleged involvement in the incident that led to Valeria's death. On August 1st, the parents of Valeria were summoned to the prosecutor's office in the capital for an important meeting. They believed this meant that new evidence had come to light, and that the detainees would finally face the punishment they deserved. Miguel and Jacqueline were devastated to hear that Valeria was killed by a bullet fired by a colleague. Prosecutor Juan Carlos Carrasco personally announced the news, expressing condolences and apologizing on behalf of the entire investigation team. Valeria's parents were in shock. They couldn't grasp how it could have occurred. The fatal shot that killed Valeria was fired from a gun by one of her colleagues. A ballistics examination conducted that day confirmed this, but the results were inaccurately reported. The bullet taken from the body Valeria was incorrectly categorized with different characteristics, such as shape, caliber, and weight. Additionally, the bullet had passed through the body rather than being extracted from it. There was a mix-up in the forensic reports regarding the entry and exit wounds. The bullet did not enter through the abdomen and exit through the back as stated. In fact, the shot was fired at her back. Several pages from the autopsy report were missing, and others had been obviously tampered with. Furthermore, the detainees involved in the trial, who supposedly admitted their guilt and were about to be sentenced, began to file complaints. They alleged that their confessions were obtained through torture and intimidation, and that the firearm they had that night was not loaded. Valeria's story takes a sudden turn when she goes from a tragic hero who died on the job to a victim of betrayal, murdered by her own colleagues. In light of these new developments, the main suspects became Felipe Gilardo Era, the officer driving the police car, and Valeria's partner, Lionel Alejandro Contas Canales, who was in the back seat. Both were promptly suspended from their duties. On August 5th, it was revealed that the bullet that killed Valeria came from a service weapon. Later, an examination report showed that only Lionel had gunshot residue on his hands, making him the prime suspect. Interestingly, this information had not been disclosed earlier, as if it had been overlooked entirely. Several reports related to the ballistics examination and the pathologist's findings were mistakenly placed in an archive box, which was not properly reviewed. It remains unclear whether this was due to an accident, criminal negligence, or an intentional effort to hide important information. Now, the police officers involved in to capture the criminals that night are themselves regarded as suspects in the murder of Valeria. They, along with the previously arrested suspects, participated in a reenactment of the incident from that night. Felipe stated that from the driver's seat, he could only see Valeria, who was next to him in the front passenger seat and was the first to get out of the car. Lionel was sitting in the back and also exited, but the driver couldn't see his actions. Valeria had taken only a few steps when a shot rang out, she fell, and the suspect's car they were pursuing sped away. Lionel quickly ran to help Valeria. Lionel mentioned that he and Philippe exited the patrol car almost at the same time, but she had rushed forward as soon as the shot was fired. He firmly maintained that he did not shoot Valeria, and Philippe must witness and confirm this. He also confirmed that he was the first to reach Valeria and attempted to apply pressure to her wound. The testimonies from the witnesses varied, but the investigation revealed that Lionel was positioned behind Valeria at the time of the gunshot, and the bullet's path confirmed his location. Additionally, he was the only one with gunshot residue on his hands. New information from previously undisclosed reports and exam results led to potential motives for the crime. Lionel was arrested as the main suspect, while the previously detained young men were released with a non-exit agreement, since there were no charges against them. However, the reason for Lionel's actions is still uncertain. The primary theory was that the incident was a tragic accident. It is believed that Lionel, inexperienced officer, accidentally discharged his weapon while standing behind Valeria. In a state of panic, he tried to assist her, and when he returned his service weapon that day, he claimed he hadn't fired it. However, the truth soon emerged, and the young man's powerful relatives used their wealth and connections to try to cover up the incident. Because of that, the cleaned reports, missing documents, confusing evidence, and coerced testimonies from the detained individuals contributed. One theory, which Lionel himself partially confirmed, was that he was in love with Valeria and desperately wanted her attention. Unfortunately, his attempts only annoyed her, and she didn't even invite him to her birthday party, which the whole department attended. The shot in the back was his way of seeking revenge for this rejection. Another theory, suggested by Valeria's relatives, was that Valeria had uncovered something she shouldn't have, perhaps a corruption scheme or official misconduct. Being an honest and fair person, she would expose the culprit, leading to her being murdered to cover up the evidence. Young Lionel was chosen to carry out this act, with the promise that he would remain above suspicion. After Philippe was taken into custody, suspicions regarding Philippe remained. He was armed with the same type of service weapon, stood behind Valeria, and had the opportunity to fire the shot. Additionally, Philippe had a history of discipline for the unjustified use of a weapon during a criminal arrest, although no one was hurt in that incident. Because of this, he earned the nickname, the Reckless Shooter. Lionel's defense team quickly adopted this theory, claiming that Philippe accidentally shot Valeria. Since both Philippe and Lionel carried identical service weapons, it was possible that the guns were mixed up or intentionally swapped. Additionally, Philippe was inconsistent in his testimony, changing it multiple times. He later said he couldn't accurately recall the incident of that night because everything happened so quickly. However, no gunpowder residue was found on his hands, suggesting he was innocent. In response, Lionel claimed that gunpowder got on his hands while he was applying pressure to Valeria's wound, and that Era, who also assisted she, might have washed his hands before the examination. This explanation was not credible, as Valeria's blood stains were still on Philippe's hands, and it is impossible to wash away gunpowder without also removing blood. The trial and verdict have raised concerns about the competence of the investigation team, leaving Valeria's parents feeling desperate in their quest for justice. The new developments in the case led to public outrage and diminished trust in law enforcement. This story garnered attention not just from Chilean media but also from international outlets. As a result, several high-ranking officials were suspended or lost their jobs, including the head of the Homicide Investigation Department. Following a further investigation, Lionel was identified as the sole suspect, with all others cleared and designated as witnesses. In the spring of 2022, he was officially charged and remained in custody until the trial concluded. The hearings for the case began in March of the following year, and based on the evidence and witness testimonies, Lionel's guilt was clearly established. At first, the prosecution charged Lionel with intentionally murdering Valeria and aimed for the harshest possible sentence. But Lionel maintained that he would never hurt Valeria because he loved her. However, the bullet that killed her came from his gun. Lionel Alejandro Contas Canales was convicted of manslaughter and received a 12-year prison sentence, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. After the verdict was announced, the Vivano family voiced their disappointment, believing the sentence was too light. Meanwhile, Lionel and his legal team quickly filed several appeals. In February 2024, Valeria's family received a shocking update when the Supreme Court unexpectedly reduced the punishment for Lionel to just 540 days in prison, starting from the day he was arrested. This meant he effectively walked out of the courtroom a free man. In response, Valeria Vivano's family intends to sue the Chilean government, alleging that the judges acted corruptly. In a statement, Valeria's mother expressed her heartbreak, stating that the original 12-year sentence had felt too lenient, but the new decision felt like a mockery. She mentioned that it was as if she had lost her daughter all over again and that she no longer had faith in justice. Furthermore, she emphasized that their family was determined to hold the negligent Chilean government for what had happened. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Linda Sladen. Linda Patterson Sladen was born on March 8, 1950. At 16, she became pregnant with her first son, Jeff, and 3 years later, her second son, Tim. To build a stable family, she convinced her boyfriend, Frank Sladen, to marry her. Unfortunately, the marriage turned out to be disastrous. Frank's alcoholism addiction led to routine abuse of Linda and their sons. Jeff and Tim remember their father's violent behavior, which was triggered by his drinking. The abuse was so severe that Linda considered divorce, and in 1974, she finally escaped the toxic marriage. After 9 tumultuous years, Linda divorced Frank and started a new life as a single mother to her 2 teenage sons. Despite financial struggles and limited resources, she worked hard to provide for her family and be a caring presence in her sons' lives. Without a car, Jeff and Tim often walked to school or relied on others for rides. Jeff and Tim loved playing football, but they didn't have a ride to practice, so their coach, Coach Joseph, would often give them a lift to and from their home. Around the same time, Linda was preparing her home for her mother's visit. She wanted her mother to move in, hoping her presence would help tidy up the house and make it feel more welcoming. Linda's sister Judy would often visit her, and they would spend their time chatting over coffee. However, on September 4, 1981, Judy arrived at Linda's apartment around 8:30 a.m. to find something shocking. The night before, on September 3, 1981, Jeff had come home from football practice to find no food, so he went to his grandparents' place. He returned home around 9:30 p.m. to find the house empty. Later, around 11:30 p.m., Linda and her younger son Tim came home. Linda had been at a neighbor's place playing cards, and before that, she had done some household chores. Jeff saw his mom doing the dishes, while Tim went to bed. Jeff apologized to his mom for their earlier argument, and they made up before Linda said goodnight to her boys. Jeff's last words to his mother were, "I love you, Mom, I'll see you tomorrow," but tragically, that would be the last conversation they would ever have. On September 4, 1981, at around 8:30 a.m., Judy visited Linda's apartment. When she knocked on Linda's bedroom door, there was no response. This was unusual, as Linda typically woke up before the boys left for school. Judy thought maybe Linda was still asleep, but as she turned to leave, she noticed something odd. The window in Linda's room was open, and the sheet that usually covered it was missing. Judy's concern grew, and she knocked on the door again. This time, she opened it and was met with a horrific sight: Linda's lifeless body on the floor, a wire clothes hanger wrapped around her neck. Linda was partially undressed, and her cupboard was wide open, but there were no signs of a struggle. Everything else in the room was in its usual place. Judy's scream alerted a nearby caretaker, who immediately called 911. Within minutes, the police, news reporters, and medical services arrived at the scene. The area was quickly cordoned off. Tim and Jeff were abruptly awakened by police officers, who then asked them to leave their home, which had become a crime scene. Jeff managed to avoid seeing his lifeless mother by passing by her room quickly, but Tim caught a glimpse of her for the last time. The two boys were subsequently sent to live with their grandparents while the investigation continued. Tragically, their mother, Linda, had been murdered at the age of 31. As soon as the boys had left, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police Department arrived at the crime scene to take charge of the case. He played a crucial role in the investigation and discovered vital evidence. Upon beginning his examination of the scene, Sergeant Pickett found several fingerprints in Linda's bedroom. While most belonged to the victim, one print did not match Linda's appeared. A palm print was discovered on the windowsill of Linda Slayton's bedroom, the same window that was missing a sheet, sparking an investigation into her death. An autopsy revealed multiple bruises and marks on her arms, shoulders, and neck, and her partially naked body suggested possible sexual assault. The autopsy results confirmed that Linda was brutally beaten, sexually assaulted, and then strangled to death with a metal clothes hanger from her own closet. The palm print found on the windowsill was a crucial piece of evidence, but unfortunately, forensic DNA analysis was not available at the time. As a result, the police had to explore Linda's family tree to identify potential suspects. The primary suspect was Frank Slayton, Linda's ex-husband, who had a history of aggression and abuse. In 1975, during their divorce, Linda described Frank as having an aggressive nature and being neglectful of his family. He was brought in for questioning, but an alibi checked out, placing him at home in Alabama on the night of Linda's murder. The police also had other individuals in mind. One of them was Jeff Slayton, Linda's son. The reason for this was a heated argument between Jeff and his mother that occurred before her murder. As the eldest son, Jeff had a complex relationship with his mother, having grown up in a household with an abusive father and later a single mother. Although Jeff and his mother frequently argued, they always managed to make amends. On the night of the murder, Jeff had made up with his mother before going to bed. When questioned by the police, Jeff passed 2 polygraph tests, which led to his name being cleared from the list of suspects. By September 2001, the police were struggling to find new leads in the case, nearly a year after the murder. However, things took a turn when they received information about a 24-year-old man who was reportedly involved in a similar crime, reigniting their investigation. Jimmy Ulmer was a suspect in Linda's murder case due to a previous crime where he attempted to abduct a 10-year-old girl through her bedroom window. A police check revealed that Ulmer had received an 80-year prison sentence, and his crimes bore a striking resemblance to Linda's case. Furthermore, Ulmer had been living in the same apartment complex as Linda at the time of the murder. The evidence against him made Ulmer the prime suspect, but he died during the investigation, making a DNA match impossible without exhuming his body. Fortunately, Ulmer's mother allowed the authorities to collect a DNA sample from him, but the results did not match. With Ulmer ruled out, the investigation turned to other potential suspects, but no one was ever charged. Despite looking into other leads, the case eventually went cold. The Slayton brothers, Linda's children, were now left to cope with the loss of their mother, relying solely on their grandparents, Clarence and Margaret Harris, for support. After Linda passed away, her family held a funeral and gradually returned to their normal routines. Her sons went back to school, and as time went by, they began to heal and move on from what had happened. Tim eventually started playing football again, and he found comfort in the support of his teammates and coach Joseph, who would often give him rides to and from practice. Tim put up a photo of his team in his bedroom, which became a source of motivation for him to keep moving forward and overcome his challenges. After their mother's death, the young Slayton brothers grew into men who built loving families of their own. Jeff got married and had 2 children, while Tim also started a family. As the years passed, both brothers regularly checked in with the Lakeland investigators to see if there were any updates on their mother's case. By 1998, Sergeant Edgar Pickett had left the case, and a new investigation team took over. Detective Brad Grace was assigned to the Slayton case and began reviewing the evidence. He discovered unidentified DNA from the 1981 crime scene and sent it to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's Major Crime Lab for analysis. By 1999, the lab had successfully developed a full DNA profile of the killer. In 2001, Detective Grace reviewed the list of suspects in the Slayton case, determined to collect DNA samples from each one. He arranged a meeting with the Slayton brothers and collected their DNA samples, which were sent for further testing. However, the results revealed no match with the DNA profile of the suspected murderer. After clearing Jeff's name, Detective Grace turned his attention to Frank Slayton. Frank had since quit drinking and appeared to have overcome his aggressive tendencies, even reconnecting with his sons, Tim and Jeff. Frank agreed to submit his DNA for testing, but it did not match the DNA profile. Detective Grace attempted to find a match for the unidentified DNA profile by submitting it to the FBI's National DNA Database in 2005. Over the years, he eliminated dozens of suspects through DNA evidence, but he retired in 2015 after 17 years on the case. The case was then assigned to new detectives, Tommy Hathcock and Russell Hurley. Detective Tommy made a significant breakthrough in the investigation 3 years in, when they discovered that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement had developed a cutting-edge technology that could help identify unidentifiable DNA. She immediately sent the unidentified DNA from the Slayton case to a genetic genealogist, who uploaded it to a public genealogy website called GMatch. The website, run by Moore, produced a list of people who shared DNA with the killer. Moore then used birth certificates, marriage certificates, obituaries, and social media to build a genetic family tree. As she dug deeper, she created 3 branches of the family tree that led to a single individual who was likely responsible for Linda Slayton's murder. The DNA profile and family tree pointed to one person, Joseph Clinton Mills, also known as Coach Joseph. In a shocking twist, it turned out that Joseph was a familiar face to the Slayton family. His picture even hung on Tim's bedroom wall, with Joseph standing just above Tim's shoulder. Upon learning the killer's name, detectives Tommy and Russell began investigating Joseph Mills' background. They uncovered a history of crimes, including grand theft committed through forging a will. Although Joseph was never charged for this crime, the police had collected his palm and fingerprints. Significantly, a palm print matching Joseph was found on the windowsill at the crime scene by Sergeant Edgar Pickett. The family of the deceased might finally find closure in a cold case that had been open for over 40 years. To confirm their suspicions, investigators compared the palm prints taken from Linda Slayton's windowsill in 1981 to the suspect's palm print and found a match. However, they still needed to compare a recent DNA sample from the suspect to the DNA evidence from the Slayton case. To do this without alerting the suspect, detectives decided to obtain his DNA for testing without his knowledge. To gather evidence, investigators took garbage bags from Joseph Mills's house and searched them at the police station for items that could contain his DNA. While sorting through the trash, they found a piece of medical adhesive tape in one of the bags and sent it to the crime lab for testing. As they awaited the DNA results, the detectives looked into Joseph's private life. He was a 58-year-old married man with children and grandchildren who had spent most of his life in Kathleen, Florida, just 30 minutes from the crime scene. 2 weeks later, the crime lab results came in, revealing that the unknown DNA found at the scene matched the DNA on the medical adhesive tape. In December 2019, detectives arrested Joseph and brought him in for questioning. It was discovered that Joseph was only around 20 years old when he committed the crime in 1981. Police had spoken to him over the phone just a day after the murder, but Joseph had told investigators that he had dropped the victim off after football practice on the night of September 3, 1981, the evening before the murder. The police did not initially suspect Joseph, but he eventually became a person of interest. During questioning, Joseph claimed that Linda Slayton had invited him over for consensual sex. However, investigators thought this was a fabricated story. They suspected that Joseph had actually targeted Linda before the night of the murder, partly because he had frequently given her son, Tim, rides to and from football practice, and also because he had been seen lingering around the Slaytons' residence. According to Joseph's statement, on the night of September 3, 1981, after dropping Tim off at his house after football practice, Joseph returned to the Slaytons' residence when no one was home. He broke in through Linda's bedroom window and hid in her closet until she went to bed. Once she was asleep, Joseph emerged from the closet, beat, sexually assaulted, and ultimately strangled Linda using a wire hanger from her closet. Joseph Mills was found guilty of first-degree murder and sexual battery. During his sentencing, family members of the victim, Linda Slayton, confronted him and demanded to know why he committed the crime. However, Joseph failed to provide any explanation or apology, simply stating, "I am a good person." The judge sentenced Joseph to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Although the Slayton family found some comfort in knowing that Joseph will spend the rest of his life behind bars, they were still outraged that he was able to live freely for so many years while they suffered without their mother. Tim, Linda's son, was particularly shocked by the revelation. Joseph had been a role model and coach to him, and Tim had looked up to him. However, it turned out that Joseph had been playing a sinister game. He would often ask Tim about the progress of the case, pretending to show concern, while secretly trying to gather information and avoid suspicion. Joseph would ask about new leads and news, but Tim had no idea that the killer was standing right in front of him. Even today, Tim does not believe that the person he trusted most was actually his mother's killer. In fact, he says he had the killer's picture in his home for years without ever suspecting anything. Jeff, still grieving, often wonders how life would be different if Linda were still alive. Despite the traumatic experience, Tim and Jeff have remained very close. They often visit their mother's grave together, and Jeff never fails to light a candle on the anniversary of her death. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Ingrid Line. Ingrid Line was born on August 2, 1975. She lived in Renton, Washington, just outside Seattle, with her 3 young daughters. Ingrid was a nurse at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. She balanced her career with taking care of her young children. After divorcing Philip Line, who was also the father of her children, they agreed to share parenting responsibilities. Although divorced, Ingrid and Philip still maintained a friendly relationship to effectively raise their daughter together. Ingrid's world revolved around her daughters, Noelle, 10, Brooke, 8, and Reese, 6. She was devoted to their safety and happiness, willing to sacrifice whatever was necessary. On April 9, 2016, Philip Line visited Ingrid at their residence in Renton, Washington, in a visit intended to care for their children together. Philip was sure that Ingrid would be home to welcome him. But when he arrived at the house, Philip was unable to reach Ingrid by phone, so he then contacted Ingrid's mother, Jorga, for support. Jorga and Philip entered Ingrid's house using Jorga's key and began searching for Ingrid. They found Ingrid's wallet, phone, and other personal items, including her driver's license, but no sign of Ingrid. It seemed unusual for her to leave without telling anyone. Worried, Jorga decided to report Ingrid missing to the authorities. As the investigation progressed, police spoke to Ingrid's friends and neighbors, eventually learning that she had mentioned going on a date with a man the night before. A neighbor also mentioned that Ingrid had recently started seeing a man named John, which was news to Jorga and Philip. Ingrid and Jorga had previously shared phone accounts, allowing Jorga to access Ingrid's call logs. When reviewing the logs, Jorga discovered that Ingrid had made multiple calls to a number registered in Montana. Jorga became suspicious and looked up the phone number online and discovered it was linked to John Robert Charlton's Facebook account. Concerned for Ingrid's safety, Jorga sent a text message to the number on Saturday, saying she had contacted 911 to report her daughter missing. John Charlton replied, looking surprised and asking what was going on. He explained that he and Ingrid had attended a Mariners game the previous day but then broke up because Ingrid needed to take care of her children early the next morning. Even though Jorga was repeatedly asking him to talk to the police, John Charlton refused to stop responding. The case reached a new turning point on April 9th, when a Seattle resident named Mike Novasio placed an emergency call to authorities. Mike reported that when he returned home, he noticed one of his recycling bins had an unusual weight, which had been left outside for collection on April 7th. Mike had noticed something was wrong and had decided to investigate. When he had opened the trash can, he had been shocked to find 3 clear plastic bags, one of which had appeared to contain human remains, which was why he had immediately called the authorities. When the police and medical examiner had arrived, they had carefully examined the contents of the bags. Inside, they had found a human head, a foot, an arm, and a leg. Although the remains had shown no signs of decomposition, facial features had still been recognizable, allowing them to identify the remains as those of Ingrid. In the following days, more of Ingrid's remains had been found. Some had been discovered at a recycling facility, while others had been found in coolers at another location. Unfortunately, not all of Ingrid's remains had been found. During a search of Ingrid's home, police had found tickets to a Mariners game on her laptop dated April 8th. It had been believed that Ingrid and John had attended the game scheduled for 7:10 p.m. on April 11th. As a result, John had been arrested and taken for questioning. During interrogation, John had admitted knowing Ingrid and said they had been dating for about a month after meeting online. He had usually spent the night at her place. But on this particular night, he hadn't because her children would be home the next day. John had claimed that he had gone to a bar with Ingrid after the Mariners game and then driven back to her home in Renton in her car. He had said he had been very drunk and didn't remember much of what had happened after that. He had remembered having sex with Ingrid and her acting strangely, but his memory of the rest of that night had been unclear. When asked what he had done afterward, John had said he wasn't sure, but he had thought he might have slept on a sidewalk in downtown Seattle and woken up there the next morning. He guessed that Ingrid had dropped him off downtown before leaving. John had told authorities he was struggling with alcoholism and had no fixed residence. A physical examination had been conducted and John's injuries had been documented with photographs. He had had scratches on his left hand and forehead, cuts on his mouth and chin, and scratches on his chest. His ex-girlfriend had said she had seen him on April 9th and had noticed his lip was swollen and injured. John had explained his injuries by saying he had been robbed, but this had aroused suspicion among investigators due to John still having his wallet. Ingrid's car had been found by law enforcement in Belltown, a neighborhood near Seattle, on April 20th. However, this discovery raised a contradiction with John's original statement. John had claimed that Ingrid had dropped him off in downtown Seattle and then had driven back home, but evidence from the car had shown otherwise. Police had discovered trash bags in the car that were identical to the bags containing Ingrid's body parts. 3 fingerprints on the driver's door handle had matched John's, leading to his arrest on suspicion of having killed Ingrid and having stolen her car. John's arrest had been based largely on circumstantial evidence. Despite this, he had pleaded not guilty, and his defense team had argued that there had been no direct physical evidence linking him to Ingrid's murder. Initially denying involvement, John had eventually changed his plea to guilty before the trial had begun. During court proceedings, the prosecution had alleged that John had strangled Ingrid at her home and then had used a pruning saw to dismember her body in the bathtub. John had allegedly dumped Ingrid's body in multiple locations in Seattle. At her residence, police had found a nearly empty package of plastic bags identical to those containing her body. In the bathroom, authorities had discovered a 15-inch pruning saw, suspected to have been the tool used to dismember her body. They had also found human remains underneath the bathtub during their investigation. John had been sentenced to just over 27 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under state sentencing discretion. However, Judge Julie Spector had wanted to impose a life sentence because John's actions had been too serious. When given the opportunity to speak, John had apologized to the court and Ingrid's family and had said that he truly regretted his evil and cruel behavior. John had had a long history of run-ins with the law, including convictions for serious crimes such as aggravated robbery, felony theft, and assault. He had also been arrested for theft. However, it had been his behavior at home that had worried his parents the most. In 2006, John's parents had felt threatened by their son's actions and had obtained a temporary protective order against him. According to court records, John had been struggling with the pressures of life and had been experiencing psychological instability. On March 2, 2006, he had been drunk and aggressive, trying to fight with his parents at his home. His behavior, not only in words but also in actions, had posed a threat to their safety. John's parents had been concerned about his possible cocaine use and his tendency to hold grudges for years. They had also noticed that when he had been drunk or on drugs, he had become scary, making them fear for their safety. One incident that stands out is when John had forced his mother to watch the movie Hannibal and had warned her to watch this and be careful. This behavior had been disturbing and had added to their concerns. Despite initial concerns, John's parents had eventually asked that the protective order be withdrawn. Following Ingrid's murder, the grief experienced by her family and friends had been immense, reflecting the loss of a caring mother, daughter, and friend. In the wake of Ingrid's tragic death, the community had come together to support her family, demonstrating strength through adversity. Ingrid's memory would continue to live on in the hearts of those who had known and loved her. Her story served as a reminder to prioritize safety and caution when meeting people online. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Ronald Platt. July 28, 1996, began as a typical summer day in South England. Captain John Kopek and his son prepared for a fishing trip on their trawler, the Melkerry. Despite an unsuccessful day, they decided to try their luck in a spot known as the Roughs. They lowered the net into the water and waited. The two men felt a tug on the net, indicating that it was a large catch. However, when they pulled the net up, they were shocked to find that it was not a fish, but instead a badly decomposed body of a man. Captain Kopek immediately contacted the Brixham Coast Guard to report the discovery. The body was in a state of severe decomposition, indicating that it had been in the ocean for some time. Fish had nibbled at parts of the body, but despite the decomposition, the man's clothing was intact: a long-sleeved shirt, corduroy pants, and brown shoes. And there was no identification on the body. The only identifying features found on the dead man were a smudged tattoo on his right hand and a Rolex watch on his wrist. The body was taken to the medical examiner's office in Devon for further examination. It was estimated that the man was between 40 and 50 years old. A distinctive tattoo of a cluster of stars was found on his body. His only severe injury was a head wound, which was not fatal. This, combined with other bruising, suggested that he had been dragged along the seabed before being pulled into a boat. However, his lungs were filled with water, indicating that he had ultimately drowned. Police suspected that the man might have fallen overboard during a ferry crossing. The primary method for identifying him was through dental records, as they would be on file if he was a British citizen. However, this process would take some time. It was by chance that a mortuary technician noticed the man's watch, a Rolex Oyster self-winding model that was fully waterproof. The watch required regular motion to stay active and, as an original model, its ownership could potentially be traced. Police examined the watch found on the unidentified man and discovered a crucial clue. The calendar feature showed the date July 22nd, indicating that the man had likely drowned 2 days earlier, on July 20th, 1996. Further examination revealed a serial number hidden between the wristband and the watch face. Police sent this number to Rolex to verify its authenticity and determine who owned the watch. The mystery surrounding the man, now known as Rolex Man, gained further clues a few weeks later, after a records search identified the watch's owner as Ronald Joseph Platt. Ronald Joseph Platt was a 51-year-old TV repairman born in Calgary, Canada. His family later moved to Britain, where he grew up. Ronald remained unmarried and had served in the British Army as part of his national service. Those who knew him well described Ronald as a quiet and introverted man with a deep love for his native Canada. Ronald bought a Rolex watch in Germany in 1967, which became one of his most prized possessions. Ronald was so attached to the watch that, according to his former partners, he even wore it in the shower. Detective Constable Clenahan from the Devon and Cornwall Police was assigned to the case from the start. The police investigation revealed that Ronald's last known address was in Essex, which was hundreds of miles away from where his body was found. Clenahan contacted the Essex Police Department for assistance. Inspector Peter Redmond offered to visit the address to help with the investigation. When he visited the house, Peter found it vacant. Peter then contacted the owner and was told that the owner had moved out some time ago. However, Peter was provided with a letter of introduction that could assist in the investigation. The letter provided the address and contact details of a man named David Davis. Detective Peter called the number and got in touch with Davis. Before delivering the news, Peter asked Davis about his relationship with Ronald. Peter then informed Davis that a body had been found in Devon that was likely to be his friend. Davis agreed to meet with the police in Essex to discuss the matter further. When they met, Peter found Davis to be friendly and confident, but surprisingly calm, and asked very few questions about Ronald's death. Davis and Ronald had been friends for several years. Davis hadn't seen Ronald in over 3 months, and the last time they met, Davis had given him a loan to start an electrical business in France. Since then, Davis had assumed Ronald was living in France. During their conversation, Peter discovered that the symbol tattooed on Ronald's hand was a maple leaf, the national symbol of Canada. After providing all the necessary information, Davis left the station, assuring Detective Peter that he would send a photo of Ronald. The Essex police were then able to conclude their investigation, forming the theory that Ronald had fallen overboard and drowned in the channel. This theory aligned with Davis's account of the events, suggesting it was simply an unfortunate accident. With the Essex case over, Clenahan had a problem on his end. He tried to contact Davis several times but was unsuccessful. Clenahan then asked his colleague, Detective Peter of Essex, to help him contact Davis. Peter agreed and visited Davis at his home in Wooden Walter, a rural area of Essex with only 4 houses. They continued to describe Ronald to Peter, and he suddenly realized that the man they were describing was none other than the recently deceased Ronald Platt. This sudden revelation aroused Peter's suspicions, and he quickly contacted Clenaghan in Devon to share this surprising discovery. Police from both counties began to suspect that there was more to the case than initially appeared. Peter turned his attention to gathering information about the man impersonating his deceased friend. Peter visited an elderly couple, Frank and Aubrey, who shared with him the story of Ronald Platt, a young man with a wife and 2 young children. The couple mentioned that Ronald and his family frequently vacationed in Devon, where they owned a yacht, although they could not remember the name of the yacht. In Devon, Clenaghan reviewed the evidence and began reinterrogating old witnesses. His first was John Coppock, who revealed that when Ronald's body was found, a 10-pound anchor had also been pulled up in the net. John Coppock had given the anchor to a friend, who then passed it on to his mother to sell. Fortunately, the anchor had not yet been sold, allowing the police to retrieve it as evidence. Clenaghan's next step was to interview people who knew Ronald. He contacted Ronald's brother, Brian. Brian mentioned Elaine Boyes, Ronald's old friend of 13 years. Police then spoke with Elaine Boyes and discovered the connection between Ronald Platt and Davis. Elaine Boyes had met Davis in 1991 while working as a receptionist at a fine arts auction house in Harrogate, England. She recalled Davis as being tall, engaging, and charming. During their conversation, Davis mentioned his plans to move to Yorkshire, and the topic turned to job opportunities. Davis offered Elaine Boyes a job at his company, but she declined, explaining that she and Ronald were planning to move to Canada soon. Davis offered to help Elaine Boyes and Ronald save money to move to Canada. Elaine Boyes soon became Davis's executive assistant, and she soon introduced Ronald to Davis. The 2 men quickly became close friends. Elaine Boyes and Ronald were fascinated by Davis's lavish stories and impressed by his lavish lifestyle. Davis then offered them a business opportunity, proposing that they become directors of his company, the Cavendish Corporation. Although Elaine Boyes was initially hesitant, Davis explained that he wanted to keep a low profile due to his ex-wife, a wealthy doctor in New York, who allegedly still demanded alimony payments from him. By this point, Elaine Boyes and Ronald had developed a trust in Davis and believed that he was genuinely trying to protect her from his ex-wife. Davis sent both Elaine Boyes and Platt on business trips to Europe to negotiate deals on his behalf, gradually drawing them into his scheme. They transferred money to various offshore bank accounts without asking Davis what he intended to do with it, trusting him greatly because of his religious nature. On Christmas Day 1992, Davis invited Elaine Boyes and Ronald to visit Davis and his daughter, Noelle. After a sumptuous meal, they exchanged gifts. Elaine Boyes presented Davis with a card titled "The Greatest Gift Ever." In return, Davis gave the couple 2 plane tickets to Canada, provided they used them before February 1993. While Elaine Boyes was overwhelmed by the short notice, Ronald was overjoyed that his lifelong dream of returning to Canada had finally come true thanks to Davis. In preparation for their upcoming trip, Davis quickly made arrangements. To ensure he could effectively manage their affairs while they were away, he asked Elaine Boyes and Ronald to stamp their signatures and leave their driver's licenses with him in case they needed to prove their identity. Elaine Boyes and Ronald agreed, as they trusted Davis and were grateful for the new beginning he provided. Consequently, in February 1993, they left for Canada. However, the harsh winter conditions, lack of job opportunities, and resulting financial strain quickly put pressure on their relationship. Elaine Boyes and Ronald's relationship began to unravel due to increasing tension, ultimately causing them to drift apart. 5 months later, Elaine Boyes traveled to England to serve as a bridesmaid at her sister's wedding, with no intention of returning to Canada. Davis, who had become a family friend, was also invited to the wedding. During the event, he spoke with Elaine Boyes and asked about Ronald. Upon learning that Elaine Boys had ended her relationship with Ronald and would not be returning to Canada, Davis was upset. He attempted to persuade Elaine Boys to give Ronald another chance, but she refused. Davis packed up his life, said goodbye to Elaine Boys, and left her with his mobile number. However, their friendship eventually dissolved, and the phone calls ceased. Ronald and Elaine Boys had lost contact. Ever since Elaine Boys moved away from Canada, she had not heard from Ronald, her former lover, or Davis, who had been her best friend. So when Davis suddenly contacted Elaine Boys in late 1996, their conversation was somewhat awkward. They barely exchanged any important information, and surprisingly, Davis did not even mention Ronald's name. The conversation was brief, and they did not keep in touch after that. He failed to tell her that Ronald was dead. After the interview, Elaine Boys suspected Davis was involved in Ronald's death. Police needed more concrete evidence. They started questioning witnesses. Following the wedding in Harrogate, Davis quickly moved to Devon with his family. There, he introduced himself as Ronald Platt. He also introduced his pregnant daughter as his wife, sometimes calling her Elaine Boys. It was well known that Davis owned a yacht. Witnesses reported seeing Ronald and Davis together a month before Ronald's body was discovered. They claimed to have registered on Steam Packet as brothers, David and Ronald Platt. By this point, police knew Davis had lied about Ronald and his knowledge of Ronald's death. They needed one last piece of evidence to confirm their suspicions. Police analyzed mobile records and discovered that the calls made by Davis originated from the same area where the medical examiner believed Ronald had drowned. This led Essex police to plan a sting operation to arrest Davis on suspicion of Ronald's murder. The police were informed by Elaine Boys that Davis had arranged to meet her for coffee at Chelmsford train station. The police arrived at the train station, however, Davis had escaped. Not giving up, Detective Peter decided to drive to the Davis family home. Pete called for backup. He speculated that Davis might be armed. As the police prepared to act, a taxi stopped at the entrance of the house, and Davis quickly escaped. The police promptly gave chase, and Davis was eventually caught and forced to surrender at gunpoint after Davis was arrested. Police took his fingerprints and submitted them to an international database. Albert Johnson Walker, a man on Interpol's wanted list and Canada's most wanted fugitive, was identified as the owner of the discovered prints. Albert Johnson's life story began in Canada. Born on August 9, 1945, in Hamilton, Ontario, Albert Johnson had big ambitions despite dropping out of high school. He had a charismatic presence. Albert Johnson met his ex-wife, Barbara MacDonald. They married in 1968. The couple started a family early and had 7 children, 3 girls and 4 boys. Albert Johnson was born in Paris, Ontario, where he and his wife Barbara started a freelance accounting business. The business grew rapidly, and within a decade, it had expanded to 6 locations with more than 30 employees. However, Albert Johnson deceived his friends and clients by secretly transferring their investments to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Over time, Albert Johnson's dishonesty wasn't the only problem he faced. His marriage began to fall apart due to his many affairs. Furthermore, those he had stolen money from began to become suspicious. With his empire on the brink of collapse, Albert Johnson decided to go on the run in 1990. Under the pretext of taking his 15-year-old daughter Sheena on a skiing trip to Europe, Albert Johnson escaped. Barbara discovered the incident and, concerned for her daughter's safety, reported her missing. The police tracked Albert Johnson to London, but lost track of him. Albert Johnson assumed a new identity, stolen from a client. He now went by the name Davis Wallace, and his daughter Sheena changed her name to Noel. Although he evaded the police, the name Davis linked him back to his real identity. Davis Wallace needed a new identity, and his opportunity came when he met Ronald Platt. Ronald had a strong interest in Canada. Davis used this information to his advantage and created a new identity for himself. However, his plans began to fall apart in 1995 when Ronald contacted him, saying that Ronald was frustrated with life in Canada and was moving back to Essex to be closer to Davis. This development posed a problem for Davis, as having two Ronald Platts with the same birth date in the same area would have raised suspicion. To solve this problem, Davis came up with a plan. He bought a yacht, the Lady Jane, and took his family and Ronald to Totnes and Devon to celebrate the launch. During this trip, Davis and Ronald purchased a new 10-pound anchor. Davis invited Ronald to Devon for the weekend to go fishing and enjoy the coast. Davis took Ronald to his boat, the Lady Jane, far enough from shore to avoid detection. Once alone, Davis hit Ronald over the head with the anchor, knocking him unconscious. Davis then searched Ronald's pockets for identification and retrieved it. Davis tied the anchor to Ronald's waist to weigh him down and threw him into the water, intending to make it look like an accident. However, Davis made the mistake of leaving Ronald's Rolex watch on his wrist, which was later used to foil the carefully planned crime and bring Davis to justice. Davis's trial began in 1998. During the trial, some key evidence was presented to the court. The anchor found in the net along with Ronald Platt's body. Forensic experts analyzed the wound on Ronald's head and determined that it matched the shape of the anchor. Further investigation found traces of zinc on Ronald's belt, which matched the zinc found on the anchor. It was discovered that the anchor had been attached to Ronald's belt to drown him in the sea. A search of the yacht, Lady Jane, also uncovered significant evidence. Hairs matching Ronald's were found on a cushion, and his fingerprint was discovered on the bag that had been used to carry the anchor back to the yacht. Additionally, blood was found near the rails, providing further evidence to the case. Davis's hoarding habits cost him, as documents were seized and used to prove his sham business ventures and his trail of deception. Elaine Boy's testimony provided evidence that Davis would lose a lot if Ronald Platt returned to England. And his daughter Sheena testified that Davis had been out on a yacht and looked disheveled and agitated when he returned later that day of the murder. Sheena also spoke candidly about life with Davis and how she was constantly harassed by her father and feared for her own safety. Supreme Court Justice Neil Butterfield said Davis was an extremely intelligent and ruthless individual who posed a threat to others. He stated that Davis's crimes were carefully planned and executed with precision. As a result, Davis was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. In 2005, he was allowed to move to Canada to serve his sentence. 2 years later, at the age of 61, Davis was given an additional 4-year sentence to be served concurrently. In 2015, Davis applied for parole but withdrew it at the last minute. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Kelly Cochran. Christopher Reagan grew up in Detroit, Michigan, where he received his education. At 20, he decided to serve his country and join the military. He was stationed at a base near Marquette, where he met Terry, a young teacher from Iron River. They became friends, bonding over their shared values and interests. Their friendship grew into a close relationship, but Christopher's military service didn't allow for a romantic relationship. When he left the military, he moved to Traverse City, but the distance didn't weaken their bond. In 2012, Christopher proposed a long-distance romantic relationship, and Terry agreed. They shared many common interests, including a love of nature and a desire for a peaceful lifestyle. They decided to live together in Iron River, where Christopher found a job at a factory. However, after 2 years, their passion faded and they parted ways amicably. Christopher moved out and began looking for a new place to live. He found a job in Asheville, North Carolina, and started a new chapter in his life. On October 14th, He told Terry he had taken the day off and suggested they meet up the next day for a walk. However, he failed to contact her the next day, and Terry became worried. After trying to reach him for several days, Terry filed a police report about Christopher's disappearance. The police reassured her that people sometimes disappear and then return, but Terry was concerned. At the police station, Terry told investigators that Christopher had recently received a job offer in North Carolina and might have started a new life, cutting ties with his past. However, to avoid speculation, a detailed investigation was launched. The police identified the company where Christopher had started working and contacted an employee, but surprisingly, no information about Christopher could be obtained, as he hadn't shown up to work in 10 days. Search efforts were then focused on the local woods, where Christopher often took solo trips with specially trained dogs deployed to aid in the search. Unfortunately, no trace of him was found. Terry suggested searching Christopher's former apartment to rule out any accidents or potential clues to his whereabouts. Upon entering the apartment, detectives found it in disarray, with items scattered across the floor and open closets. Although it initially seemed like Christopher was simply a messy person, Terry knew him to be more organized. The detectives began to suspect that the disarray might be related to a crime. After inspecting the apartment, they decided to expand the search area. They eventually found Christopher's car outside the city limits, about 8 miles from Iron River. Inside the car, they found ordinary clothes and a piece of yellow paper with a route written on it. The route had no specific address, but detailed notes described the path, including turning at a bus stop or driving past a gas station. Terry explained that Christopher, despite living in Iron River, wasn't familiar with the street names, so he wrote down directions in this way. The detectives followed the route, which led them to a house in a neighboring town. Upon knocking on the door, they met Jason Cochran, an overweight man, and his wife Kelly. The officers informed the couple that they were investigating Christopher's disappearance and found a piece of paper with their address in his abandoned car. Kelly revealed that she worked with Christopher at the same plant, and they were friends. Although Kelly hadn't been in contact with Christopher recently, she had tried to reach him via text messages in mid-October. She assumed he had started his new job in North Carolina and didn't respond. Kelly also mentioned Christopher's health issues, which might have led him to start anew. The investigators were puzzled by the route leading to the Cochran home and why it was in Christopher's car. Despite the lack of answers, the couple cooperated with the investigation. After further questioning, the detectives left the Cochran home and proceeded to interview Christopher's co-workers at the factory. There, they discovered that Christopher was having an affair with Kelly Cochran, which had been rumored for months. The investigation into Christopher's disappearance sparked a new lead when Kelly Cochran made a surprising statement. Investigators decided to re-question Kelly and her husband Jason to get to the bottom of their relationship. Kelly eventually admitted to having an affair with Christopher, but initially withheld the information because of her husband's presence. Kelly claimed that she and Jason had an open relationship and Jason was okay with her infidelity. However, Christopher's co-workers disputed this, saying that Jason did not approve of the affair and that the Cochran family did not have an open relationship. When Jason was questioned, he revealed that he was strongly opposed to his wife's infidelity, making him a suspect. However, the lack of concrete evidence meant that the investigators couldn't conclude that he was involved in Christopher's disappearance. Kelly and Jason were released from the police station, and the investigation continued for 5 months without a breakthrough. A new investigator, Detective Jeremy Ogden, took over the case and began a thorough analysis of the Cochran family's history. Kelly and Jason had met in high school and started living together after graduation. Despite their personality differences, they got married and started a swimming pool maintenance business. Jason handled most of the work, but the physical demands took a toll on his health, leaving him with back problems. When Jason's condition worsened, Kelly took over the business. During this time, Kelly sought ways to help her husband recover, including finding a medicinal plant that could help alleviate his back pain. However, the plant was banned in their state, so they moved to Michigan in 2014 to access it. In Michigan, Kelly and Jason got jobs at the same plant where Christopher worked. Kelly and Christopher became close friends, which was important to him given his relationship troubles with Terry. The prosecutors eventually obtained a search warrant for the Cochran's home, but the search yielded no evidence linking them to Christopher's disappearance. The only significant find was a book written by Jason under a pseudonym inspired by video games. The title of the book caught their attention, but its content was disturbing. The book described violent murder scenes targeting everyone who had ever wronged Jason. The detectives read it thoroughly and found a character that matched Christopher's profile exactly. This strengthened their suspicions about Jason, making them wonder if he wasn't making up the crimes, but instead drawing inspiration from real events he had committed. 3 weeks later, the police decided to conduct another search of the Cochran house, hoping to find evidence they might have missed the first time. However, when they arrived, they found the house empty and the family had moved to Indiana. This made the investigators anxious, as they feared they might not find the crucial evidence they had been searching for months, particularly DNA samples from the suspects. Michigan police contacted their Indiana counterparts to help collect DNA samples from the Cochrans. The Indiana police officers went to the Cochrans' new home, and Jason and Kelly did not object to the procedure, as there was no concrete evidence linking them to the murder. Time passed, and on February 22, 2016, Kelly called the police, frantic, saying her husband Jason was unresponsive. When the rescue team arrived, they found Kelly in a panic, trying to obstruct the doctors. Jason was sitting in a chair, his face severely burned as if from extreme overheating. The doctors confirmed his death, and the body was sent for forensic examination. During the search of the Cochrans' new home, an officer discovered a syringe needle near the bed. The forensic report revealed that Jason's death was not due to drug abuse, as initially suspected, but rather strangulation, confirmed by bruises on his neck and face. This discovery turned Jason, the prime suspect in Christopher's kidnapping, into a victim himself. The investigation became even more complex, and forensic experts shifted their focus to Kelly Cochran, who now became the prime suspect in both Christopher's disappearance and her husband's murder. Kelly was invited to the police station to testify in Jason's murder case. During the interrogation, the investigators asked her directly if she had administered excessive doses of illegal drugs to her husband or was involved in his death. However, despite the pressure, Kelly did not confess to either crime. Months later, the investigators still lacked concrete evidence to prove Kelly's guilt and justify an arrest. During the investigation, Detective Jeremy Ogden met Walter Hammerman, a close friend of Jason's, who insisted that illegal drugs could not have caused Jason's death, as he knew his friend well and would have been informed about any changes in his life. Jason had been using medicinal herbs to alleviate his chronic back pain. However, his friend Walter noticed a significant change in his behavior around March last year. Jason confided in Walter about the mounting pressure from the Iron River police, who suspected him and his wife Kelly of involvement in a man's disappearance. The ordeal had taken a toll on Jason, leaving him depressed and even suicidal, which required intensive treatment. Walter observed that Kelly had begun to exert more control over Jason's life, making him increasingly anxious and withdrawn. Jason would avoid social gatherings when Kelly was around, and their video game sessions had become a thing of the past. These observations proved crucial in the investigation, helping detectives understand the dynamics within the Cochran family. After the medical examiner determined that Jason's death was by strangulation, Detective Ogden devised a plan to lure Kelly into a trap. The plan involved using Walter as bait to prompt Kelly into making a mistake. Walter agreed to play along, and on March 12, 2016, he called Kelly under police surveillance. He pretended that Jason had given him a letter containing vital information, which Kelly was supposed to send to the police if anything happened to Jason. However, Kelly suddenly told Walter to drop the idea, catching both him and the police off guard. Despite this, detectives still lacked concrete evidence, and Kelly continued to deny her involvement during subsequent interrogations. On April 26, 2016, Kelly seemingly evaded the authorities, prompting a federal manhunt. Walter, who had cooperated with the police, was shocked and fearful that Kelly might evade justice and potentially target him. The police eventually tracked Kelly's phone to the West Coast, and on April 28, they arrested her at her cousin's home in Wingo, Kentucky. Once in custody, Kelly confessed to her relationship with Christopher Rain, revealing that she had wanted to leave her husband and start a new life with him. However, when Jason discovered her infidelity, their situation escalated, and Kelly was bound by a pact they had made on their wedding night, obliging her to kill her lover if her cheating was exposed. Kelly Cochran claimed she never intended to follow through on an agreement she made with her husband, Jason, but he was determined to see it through. The agreement was a threat to kill Christopher Rain, Kelly's lover, if she didn't end the affair. Kelly didn't want to do it, but she ultimately helped Jason commit the crime. On October 14, 2015, Christopher arrived at Kelly's house while her husband was away. Kelly offered him dinner and intimacy, and they went upstairs to the bedroom. However, Jason suddenly appeared, panicked and holding a rifle. Without hesitation, he shot Christopher in the head, killing him instantly. Under Jason's direction, Kelly helped dismember Christopher's body using a hacksaw, detaching his limbs and head from his torso. They placed the remains in trash bags and dumped them in the woods near Crystal Falls. They also drove Christopher's car away from the house to avoid suspicion and thoroughly cleaned the house to remove evidence of the crime. Kelly later confessed to her role in the crime, saying she wanted revenge against Jason for forcing her to end her affair with Christopher. She was deeply in love with Christopher and felt Jason had deprived her of happiness. Months later, on February 22, 2016, Kelly killed Jason by suffocating him after giving him a lethal dose of medication. She then helped the police find Christopher's remains, which were buried in the woods near Crystal Falls. A team of investigators and a canine unit searched the area and eventually found a human skull with a bullet hole, confirming it was Christopher's severed head. A .22 caliber bullet, a broken gun, and glasses likely belonging to Reagan were found at the scene. Dental records were used to identify the victim's remains, finally solving the 2-year-old missing person case. In April 2016, Kelly Cochran was formally charged with the murders of Christopher Regan and Jason Cochran. On February 13, 2017, the 34-year-old was arraigned in Michigan State Court. The prosecutor argued that Kelly was the mastermind behind both crimes and that her motive was rage and jealousy. Christopher viewed their relationship as casual, but Kelly genuinely loved him and wanted a future together. When Christopher refused to commit, Kelly decided to kill him, making up a story about a pact with her husband. The prosecution had strong evidence, including Kelly's confession in court. However, Kelly claimed she was being abused by her jealous husband, who had planned and committed the crime. She said he hid in the basement, caught the lovers off guard, and then shot Christopher in a rage. Kelly claimed Jason suggested dismembering the body and coerced her into helping by threatening to kill her. This version raised doubts about Kelly's guilt, but the jury still found her guilty of premeditated murder. Kelly was sentenced to life without parole. Jason Cochran's case was settled with a plea agreement, and Kelly received an additional 65 years in prison. Kelly was sent to Crown Point Correctional Facility in Michigan, where she is serving her sentence and regrets that her personal life didn't work out. In a phone interview, Kelly said, "I tried to do what I thought was right. I got married." She also shared, "It was good in the beginning, but in the end, all my efforts were in vain." All I did was work while my husband played computer games. In prison, Kelly continues to reveal details of her crimes, claiming she and Jason committed more crimes and that Christopher was just one of their many victims. However, Kelly's claims are difficult to verify, and there is no concrete evidence to support them. Her brother has also heard similar claims, but there is no evidence to back them up. Detective Jeremy Ogden is investigating the details, hoping to find evidence of other possible crimes committed by Kelly and Jason Cochran. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Kat West. The case of Kat West, Kat Dawn West. Martin was born on February 15, 1975 in Davie, Florida. She grew up as an only child in a humble and modest family environment with parents Nancy and John Jonathan Martin. As a child, Kat longed for a sibling, but her mother's health issues prevented that from happening. Instead, she became extremely attached to dolls, treating them like they were alive, singing to them, and carrying them around in school. Kat was known for her beauty and outgoing personality, actively participating in sports and dance. However, during her teenage years, she began to show signs of bipolar disorder, which included depression and anxiety, followed by periods of extreme happiness and restlessness. Unfortunately, her parents didn't realize what was happening until later. By that time, Kat had started using alcohol to cope with her emotions. It wasn't until she received treatment for alcoholism that the underlying cause of her problems was discovered. In her 20s, Kat overcame her addiction to alcohol, but managing her bipolar disorder was more difficult. She had to take several strong medications that interacted with each other and caused side effects. Eventually, her disorder was brought under control, but she had to continue taking medication for the rest of her life. Sadly, her life was cut short. Kat dreamed of a traditional life with a husband, children, and a family, but her personal struggles with a psychological disorder and alcohol issues made it challenging. Despite these difficulties, she was a popular and lively person who loved being the center of attention. Kat had aspirations to become a model and would attend castings, trying out different looks. Her idol was Marilyn Monroe, whom she admired greatly. She watched Monroe's movies repeatedly, collected posters, and imitated her style and image. Interestingly, Kat bore a resemblance to Monroe, which she happily exploited and treasured. Although Kat never became a famous model, her photos regularly appeared in local magazines, earning her some recognition and a small following. People would occasionally recognize her on the streets of her hometown. At the age of 28, she finally met the man she would start a family with, William West. William Jeffrey West, who goes by his middle name Jeffrey, was born in 1970 in Alabama, where he grew up in an ordinary family. As a child, Jeffrey envisioned a future in the military or law enforcement. He was an excellent student, enthusiastic about sports, and physically fit. In the early 1990s, Jeffrey enlisted in the U.S. military, starting as a military police officer. His commitment led him to become a recruiter, responsible for recruiting new members into the Army and Navy. He eventually became the head of a recruitment division. Throughout his life, Jeffrey dedicated 20 years to serving in the military. William balanced his military career with higher education, earning a bachelor's degree in public relations from the University of South Carolina, and later a master's degree in criminal justice and disaster and emergency management. He was intelligent, composed, and goal-oriented, yet modest and somewhat introverted, preferring quiet gatherings to loud parties and shunning the spotlight. After marrying young, he became a devoted family man and responsible parent to 2 children. After retiring from the military, William joined the police department of a university town as a corporal, tasked with ensuring campus safety. He took his duties seriously and responsibly, although he never had to use his issued service firearm throughout his career. Kat and Jeffrey, an unlikely couple, met in the mid-2000s. At the time, Jeffrey was still serving in the military and married to his first wife. Despite their differences, Jeffrey being a stern, quiet military man, and Kat being a flamboyant, bold attention seeker. They felt an instant attraction. Their differences, including their 5-year age gap, Jeffrey's existing marriage, and Kat's struggles with alcoholism, did not deter their relationship. Jeffrey filed for divorce shortly after meeting Kat, and in a whirlwind romance, they got married in a Las Vegas chapel just 5 months later in 2005. They had a daughter, Lola, and settled in Sarah, Alabama, Jeffrey's hometown, in a cozy custom-built home designed by Kat herself. The bedroom was a shrine to her idol, Marilyn Monroe, with numerous portraits adorning the walls. Despite their vastly different personalities, the Wests were known to their neighbors as a happy couple. Kat, who preferred to be called Caitlin, was a fashionista who reveled in attention. She took great care in her appearance, always donning bold makeup, stylish hair, and fashionable outfits that drew admiration. She beamed with joy, perpetually smiling, and thrived on compliments. In stark contrast, Jeffrey appeared reserved, serious, and disciplined, traits likely shaped by his lengthy military career, and often seemed overshadowed by Kat's vibrant personality. Kat struggled to succeed as a model after getting married and having a daughter. Instead, she focused on being a homemaker, but she felt unfulfilled and craved attention. With the rise of social media, Kat started posting photos online, initially harmless pictures inspired by Barbie and Marilyn Monroe. Over time, her posts became more provocative. Sources close to the couple say that Kat's husband didn't object to her new hobby and even helped her by taking photos. This turned into a profitable venture for Kat through paid subscriptions. The couple was seen buying seafood dishes, fine wine, and candles to set a romantic mood, captured on surveillance cameras. They appeared happy and carefree, joking and smiling, with no sign of the tragedy to come. After dinner, Kat, who had previously struggled with alcohol dependence, became her online persona, Kitty Cat, under the influence of the drinks. She asked her husband Jeff to take sultry photos, first in lingerie and then nude. Jeff agreed and took several revealing shots which were posted on Kat's private profile for fans only. By around 1 p.m., what was supposed to be a romantic evening escalated into a tragic nightmare. The next morning, January 13th, around 5 a.m., a young neighbor of the Wests headed to work. Although the sun hadn't risen, it was light enough outside for her to notice something unusual as she passed the Wests' house. At first, she wasn't sure what she was seeing, but as she slowed down, she realized with horror that an almost fully naked woman was lying motionless on the road. A woman witnessed someone standing on the doorstep of a house, but they vanished when they saw her. She couldn't determine if they entered the house or fled down the street. She was startled and uncertain, so she didn't approach the body right away. Instead, she went home, informed her parents, and together they called emergency services to report their discovery. At the operator's request, the family returned to the scene and examined the body. They identified it as Mrs. West, but unfortunately there was no pulse. Her body was cold, and rigor mortis had set in. Mrs. West's body lay face down on the sidewalk, wearing only a pink bra top. A blood-stained pool had formed beneath her head, and a bottle of absinthe with bloodstains was nearby. Her damaged smartphone lay a short distance away. Since the area was quiet and residential, there were no other witnesses that night. This left a mystery about what happened between 8:30 p.m., when the West's car was last seen, and 5 a.m., when the body was discovered. The only person who might know what happened is Mr. West, but is he hiding something? Detective Michael Melhoff was one of the first to arrive at the scene of the crime. He went to the house where her body was found and spoke to the man who answered the door. The man appeared anxious but claimed he didn't know what was going on. When the detective asked him where his wife was, the man said he had just woken up and couldn't find her in bed. The detective then asked the man to step outside, where he told him that her body had been found nearby, identified by neighbors as Kat West. The man put on a jacket and followed the detective, confirming that the body was indeed his wife. However, his reaction was surprisingly calm. he didn't rush to the body or show any signs of distress. When questioned about his actions the previous night, the man said he had slept soundly after a night of drinking. When asked what he thought might have happened to his wife, he simply shrugged and suggested it could have been an accident. The man also mentioned that his wife had bipolar disorder and struggled with alcoholism, which sometimes led to erratic behavior. He said that she would occasionally use their backyard trampoline, sometimes injuring herself when she missed it. A search of the house found no signs of a struggle or violence, but it did reveal evidence of a night of drinking, with 2 plates of leftover food, 2 glasses, and a half-empty brandy bottle on the kitchen table. The police found Jeffrey's wife's high heels under the table and her matching underwear on the floor, but some suspicious items caught their attention: blood-stained napkins in the trash and an open bottle of cleaner. Jeffrey was arrested as the main suspect that day. He told investigators that he and his wife Kat had a tumultuous evening. After a photo shoot, Jeffrey wanted to move to the bedroom for a more intimate setting. He left to take a shower and returned to find Kat still sitting at the table, drinking straight from the bottle and texting on her phone. This infuriated Jeffrey, and he asked her to put the phone away, but she refused. When he tried to take it from her, they had a small struggle, during which he accidentally elbowed her face, causing a few drops of blood to appear from her nose. Jeffrey claimed that this was the blood the police found on the napkins. He said he eventually took the phone from Kat and threw it out the door into the darkness. Then, he went to bed, thinking Kat would soon calm down and join him. He allegedly had no idea what happened next until the police knocked on his door, asking about Kat. Mr. West proposed several theories to explain his wife's disappearance and death. One possibility was that she went outside to find her phone, taking the absinthe bottle with her to finish it. In this scenario, she might have fallen, hit her head on the bottle, lost consciousness, and frozen to death. Alternatively, someone might have attacked her. Mr. West also found it puzzling that his wife was not wearing the bottom part of her pink lingerie set, and that she had gone outside in just a bra, without putting on any outerwear that was readily available near the entrance. He attributed these unusual actions to her being intoxicated from alcohol. The suspect's story raised suspicions due to its inconsistencies and suspicious omissions. He claimed to be too drunk to recall certain details, leaving investigators to reconstruct the sequence of events. Although there were no witnesses, the evidence suggested that the 42-year-old woman died from a blow to the head, likely caused by the absinthe bottle found nearby, which was compounded by hypothermia. The autopsy revealed that the victim's blood alcohol level was extremely high, indicating severe intoxication that would have impaired her coordination and increased her risk of losing consciousness. At first, the evidence seemed to support a simple explanation. The heavily intoxicated victim had gone outside to look for her phone, taking the unfinished bottle of absinthe with her. She likely lost her balance, fell, hit her head on the bottle, lost consciousness, and died from her injuries and exposure. However, the investigation found this scenario too convenient and suspiciously staged. Although the bottle with blood traces was found next to the victim's head and her smartphone was nearby, forensic analysis cast doubt on the idea that she had fallen and hit her head by herself. If that were the case, the bottle would likely have rolled away from her head, not remained alongside it. Kat's and her husband Jeff's fingerprints were found on a bottle, along with some unidentifiable smudged prints. The presence of blood-stained napkins and an opened bottle of household cleaner in the house led investigators to conclude that the couple had a violent argument. According to the theory presented in court, Kat's obsession with her online subscribers sparked the fight. In a fit of rage, Jeff allegedly struck Kat with the bottle, causing a fatal injury. Panicked, he attempted to make it look like an accidental fall by cleaning up the blood, but he failed to dispose of the evidence. The fitness app on Jeff's phone supported this theory, as it showed he was active in the house until midnight, and again early in the morning before the police arrived, contradicting his claim of being asleep. The police believed Jeff was trying to conceal evidence during these periods. A neighbor who discovered Kat's body remembered seeing a male figure on the doorstep who quickly left in an unknown direction in the early morning darkness. However, she couldn't confirm whether it was Jeff or someone else, nor could she say whether the person entered the house or not. The investigators were intrigued by the online presence of the deceased, who had many male admirers paying to see her revealing photos as Kitty Cat. This led them to consider the possibility of an obsessed follower among her subscribers, someone who might have tried to track her down for a personal encounter. The victim, a middle-aged homemaker, regularly received messages from men, some of which were inappropriate. However, she kept her distance, and there were no explicit threats or harassment. A few persistent fans from other states with solid alibis were quickly cleared as suspects. Despite this, mysterious footprints were found on the doorstep that didn't belong to the homeowners, but they vanished on the lawn, leaving their origin unknown. Jeffrey West's neighbors, friends, and family described the couple as happy and content, with Jeffrey aware of his wife Kat's online activities, which he viewed as harmless. However, their social circle was unaware of Kat's online persona, Kitty Cat, just as most of her followers didn't know her real identity. When asked if he had ever been violent towards Kat, Jeffrey denied it, saying he loved her too much to harm her. Despite this, the couple frequently argued, including a heated exchange on January 12th, in which Kat questioned their compatibility due to their differing personalities. Although Jeffrey remained the prime suspect based on forensic evidence and circumstantial details, his family, including his parents, daughter, and in-laws, were convinced of his innocence, adamant that he could never harm Kat. Jeffrey West was arrested and unable to post the $500,000 bail, so he remained in custody for nearly 3 years until his trial. During this time, he was offered a plea deal, which would have reduced his sentence if he admitted to killing his wife. However, he refused the deal, maintaining his innocence. The trial, which began in November 2020, received significant media attention due to Kat's online fame. This publicity put a lot of pressure on the judges and jurors. By this point, the possibility of someone else being involved in Kat's death was no longer considered. The prosecution argued that all the evidence pointed to Jeffrey West as the killer. They believed that in a fit of jealousy and while under the influence of alcohol, he hit his wife with a bottle, causing fatal injuries. In a panic, they suggested that he then staged the scene to look like an accident and removed evidence from the house. Jeffrey's defense team, on the other hand, argued that Kat's death was indeed an accident. They cited her extremely high blood alcohol levels, which they believed affected her balance and coordination. Kat's mother gave a heartfelt testimony in support of her son-in-law, describing her daughter as eccentric, but emphasizing that Jeffrey loved her deeply and would never harm her. She also asked the court to consider the well-being of their granddaughter, Lola, who had already lost her mother and now risked losing her father as well. After deliberating, the jury delivered a guilty verdict for involuntary manslaughter on January 11, 2021. Jeffrey received the maximum sentence of 13 years, including time served. It's worth noting that if he had accepted the initial plea deal, he might have already been released from prison. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Chris Coleman. On May 5, 2009, the Coleman family, who appeared to have the perfect life, was tragically murdered in their home just before 3 a.m. Let's examine the events of that night, a crime that left a lasting impact on many. Chris Coleman met his future wife, Sherry, while they were both serving in the military. For Sherry, it was love at first sight, and she knew immediately that Chris was the one she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. Within a few months of meeting, Sherry became pregnant with their first child, Garrett. As devout Christians, the couple married before Garrett was born. After Garrett's birth, Chris and Sherry had their second son, Gavin. Gavin was a lively child, whereas Garrett was more laid back, like his father. Both boys had lively personalities and were well behaved. Sherry was a devoted mother who would do anything to protect her sons. Chris was an excellent father, and the family enjoyed quality time together, laughing, playing, and cherishing every moment with their children. After leaving the military, the Colemans moved to Waterloo, Illinois, a small town, where they bought a house in an upscale neighborhood, courtesy of Chris's new job. Chris became the head of security for Joyce Meyer, a renowned TV evangelist and CEO of one of the world's largest Christian ministries. However, controversy arose due to Joyce's multi-million-dollar income and opulent lifestyle, which sparked criticism from some individuals. They accused her of being a greedy con artist who exploited her followers' fears, arguing that her financial success and lavish lifestyle conflicted with her religious teachings. As Joyce's bodyguard and personal security guard, Chris was responsible for monitoring and protecting her from hate mail and letters sent to her church, which often contained threats against her life, with people expressing their intentions to harm her. Chris earned a substantial salary of $100,000 per year working for Joyce's ministry in St. Louis, Missouri, providing financial stability for his family. As part of his job as a bodyguard, Chris frequently accompanied Joyce on international trips, ensuring his safety while abroad. However, this arrangement meant Chris was away from home for extended periods, affecting his family life. One year, Chris was gone for 260 days, which took a toll on his family, especially his sons, Garrett and Gavin. The boys missed their father and would mark off each day on a calendar, eagerly waiting for his return. However, shortly after Chris came home, he would have to leave again, causing tension in his marriage to Sherry. Sherry felt overwhelmed, shouldering the responsibilities of both parents and underappreciated for managing the household alone. The constant cycle of Chris's absence strained their relationship. In October 2008, Chris visited Tampa, Florida, where his friend Sherry had gone to high school. Sherry got in touch with her old friend Tara Lintz and asked her to look out for Chris while he was in town. After settling in, Chris contacted Tara and they agreed to meet up. Tara kindly showed Chris around the city. On November 14, 2008, at around 11 p.m., Chris received a disturbing email. The sender's email address was destroychris@gmail.com, and the subject line and content terrified him. The email warned Chris to stop working for Joyce Meyer, otherwise he or his family would be killed. Over the next few hours, more threatening emails arrived at the ministry from the same sender, repeating the threat and specifying a time and date when the attack on his family might happen. The sender seemed to know Chris's schedule and was aware that he would soon be traveling out of the country. Chris told Sherry about the threatening emails he'd been getting, and on the following Monday, he went to the local police station to report them. He explained that he'd been away from home a lot lately because he'd been traveling with Joyce Meyer Ministries. The police offered to increase their patrols around the house when Chris was away. But even with the extra police presence, Sherry was still afraid for her family's safety. Sherry was so scared that she once asked a friend to stay with her because she didn't feel safe staying alone in the house when Chris was away. She made it clear that she would do whatever it took to keep her family safe. To prove how serious she was, Sherry showed her friend that she had a gun and demonstrated how to hold it, just in case someone broke into the house while Chris was away and she wasn't there. 2 months after the death threats started, a mysterious hand-delivered letter arrived in the Colemans' mailbox. The letter was written in bold letters and was very demanding. It said, "Deny your God publicly or else. No more opportunities. Time is running out for you and your family." This threat was very ominous and specific, stating that if the Colemans didn't do what the writer wanted, they would face severe consequences. Sherry was deeply shaken by the disturbing message. The fact that someone had invaded her private space and threatened her and her family made her feel genuinely terrified throughout the ordeal. Sherry's fear grew more intense by the day. The letter she received was a constant reminder of the potential danger that lurked in the shadows, waiting to pounce. After getting a death threat in the mail, Sherry and her husband Chris decided to take extra measures to protect their family. As part of their safety plan, Chris installed surveillance cameras around their home. These cameras recorded the surroundings and sent the footage to a screen in their basement office. The footage was also saved on a digital video recorder, allowing Chris to keep a permanent record of any incidents. He hoped the cameras would help him identify the person behind the threats against their family. After the cameras were installed, the threats against the Colemans stopped. Life returned to normal for Chris, Sherry, and their sons, Garrett and Gavin. For a while, everything seemed fine. In April 2009, Sherry confided in others that she was feeling more optimistic about her marriage and was determined to make it work. She was relieved the death threats had stopped and felt a sense of happiness. However, Sherry's optimism was short-lived. A second ominous letter arrived at the Coleman home, warning her that her worst fears were about to become a reality. Chris, her husband, was unsettled by the letter's contents and decided to review the previous night's footage from their security camera. What he saw shocked him. A mysterious silhouette caught his attention, but its identity remained unclear. This new discovery reignited Sherry's fear for her own and her children's safety, plunging her back into a state of constant unease. The brief sense of security she had felt was now gone, replaced by the feeling that her worst nightmare was closing in. The local police boosted their efforts due to the rising threats against the Coleman family. A neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow from the Columbia Police Department, took a keen interest in the case. Detective Barlow personally called Chris to discuss the situation. During their conversation, Detective Barlow mentioned that he had noticed Chris's recent work absences from home. He offered help, providing his cell phone number in case Chris needed anything or had concerns. Detective Barlow reassured Chris that he could respond faster in an emergency than the regular police. Detective Justin Barlow lived across the street from the Coleman family, so he set up video cameras to monitor their driveway over several weeks. Although the cameras captured footage of the Colemans going about their daily routines, they did not capture the person responsible for leaving the death threats. Despite his efforts, the videos did not provide any clues or information about the identity of the person behind the threatening messages. On May 5, 2009, Chris went to the gym at 5:45 a.m. After leaving his house around 5:30 a.m., he called his home phone at 6:45 a.m. to check if his wife Sherry and their sons were up and getting ready for school. When no one answered, Chris became worried and called his neighbor, Detective Justin Barlow, at 6:45 a.m. to ask for his help. Chris explained to Detective Barlow that he had been trying to reach Sherry while he was at the gym, but she wasn't picking up. This made Chris increasingly concerned, so he asked Detective Barlow to check on Sherry and the boys. Detective Barlow prepared himself by grabbing his essential items, including his weapon, handcuffs, flashlight, and radio, before heading to the Coleman residence. While waiting for backup to arrive, his main goal was to make contact with Sherry and ensure everything was okay. With a mix of anticipation and apprehension, Detective Barlow approached the door and knocked firmly, hoping to get a response. However, the silence that followed made him feel uneasy. The lights inside the house were off, and there was no sign of movement, which only added to his bad feeling. Within minutes of Detective Justin Barlow's arrival at the Coleman home, a patrol vehicle pulled up with an additional officer to assist him. The second officer was sent to the rear of the house to try to see through a door or window or establish contact with Sherry or the boys at the back of the house. But as soon as the officer reached the back, he found signs of forced entry into the basement. This discovery immediately grabbed Detective Barlow's attention, and he began to suspect that someone inside the house was in danger. Detective Barlow was deeply concerned for the safety of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin after discovering the signs of forced entry into the Coleman home. Detective Barlow and the second officer decided to enter the premises through the basement. They announced their presence, but received no response. As they thoroughly searched the basement, they found a disconnected video cable at the computer desk. This led them to conclude that the camera's digital video recorder had been taken. Detective Justin Barlow and another officer made their way up from the basement of the Coleman home, ascending the stairs to the main level. As they climbed, they noticed an increasingly strong smell of aerosol spray paint. Once they reached the top, they saw that the wall had been spray painted with derogatory messages targeting Chris, Sherry, and their sons. 13 minutes after Chris phoned Detective Justin Barlow, Chris returned home from the gym. The detective told him to wait outside while they searched the house. Chris complied, sitting quietly on the porch without asking questions or trying to enter. Meanwhile, a third officer arrived at the Coleman residence. The three officers knew they had to search the rest of the house for Sherry and her sons. As they went upstairs, they found more hate-filled messages spray-painted on the walls when they reached the second story of the Coleman home. Detective Justin Barlow entered Garrett's bedroom, the oldest son's room, and initially thought he was asleep. But when he got closer, the detective realized Garrett was dead. There were no signs of life, and his body was cold to the touch. Ligature marks around his neck indicated the young boy had been murdered by strangulation. The discovery of Garrett's lifeless body shocked Detective Barlow. In the next room, the second officer found Gavin, but to his horror, the boy was also dead, just like his brother. Gavin also had ligature marks around his neck, indicating he had been strangled. The killer had even spray-painted an obscene message on the bed sheets, making the scene even more horrific. The third officer entered the master bedroom, where he was met with a deeply disturbing scene. Sherry, like her sons, was lying lifeless across the bed, her hair scattered over her face, hiding her features. It was obvious to the officer that Sherry had been brutally murdered. As he surveyed the room, he noticed multiple bruises on Sherry's body, suggesting that she had fiercely resisted her attacker, fighting to defend herself and her sons. After Detective Justin Barlow and the officers discovered the lifeless bodies of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, Chris entered the house, having waited outside for news about his family. Unaware of the gravity of the situation, Chris announced his presence. Detective Barlow then had the heartbreaking task of informing Chris that his entire family had been murdered. This devastating news crushed Chris, leaving him reeling. To give Chris some privacy to process the information, Detective Barlow accompanied him outside. However, as the reality of the situation set in, Chris's reaction was overwhelming. He became nauseous, and his body seemed to weaken. Overcome with grief, Chris curled up in a fetal position, unable to contain the torrent of emotions. The shock of the tragedy was too much for him to absorb. Chris couldn't comprehend the brutal way his family had been taken from him. In desperation, Chris reached out to his father, Ronald, and informed him that something had happened to Sherry and the boys. Ronald immediately realized Chris was in shock upon receiving the news. Ronald was equally stunned, unable to believe that this tragedy had befallen his family. News of the shocking murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman spread swiftly throughout Waterloo, Illinois, where the family lived. As the community awoke to the grim news, neighbors were left devastated and terrified. The Coleman family had always been perceived as the epitome of a perfect American family, with their charming sons, Garrett and Gavin, admired by everyone. In fact, one neighbor went so far as to say that everyone would want their children to be like Garrett and Gavin, who were always polite, helpful, and kind-hearted. For Sherry's brother and mother, the harsh reality of the brutal crime was impossible to accept. Chris Coleman, the husband and father, was taken to a nearby police station for questioning after his wife and 2 sons were discovered murdered. During the interrogation, Detective Justin Barlow asked Chris if he could shed any light on the killings. Chris expressed deep regret for leaving to go to the gym, leaving Sherry and the boys alone in the home. When Detective Barlow asked Chris if he had any idea who could have committed the murders, Chris claimed he had no idea. However, several aspects of Chris's behavior during the interview raised suspicions with the detective. One of the detective's initial concerns was Chris's lack of curiosity about the circumstances surrounding his wife and son's murder. Given the gravity of the situation, it seemed odd that Chris didn't ask questions about their deaths. Instead, he appeared uninterested in finding out the details. Additionally, the detective noticed that Chris tried to conceal scratches on his arms during the interview. He asked for a blanket, despite the warm room temperature, to hide the injuries. These scratches raised suspicions as the detective knew that Sherry, Chris's wife, had fought for her life. When questioned about the scratches, Chris claimed they resulted from installing a satellite dish the day before. During the police interview, Chris denied having an affair outside of his marriage. However, he admitted to having a close friendship with Tara, a cocktail waitress and high school friend of his wife's who lived in Florida. Chris claimed that his wife wouldn't have approved of their conversations, but he maintained that he had no intention of leaving his wife for Tara. He insisted that he would never consider betraying his family in such a way. A different story unfolded when detectives contacted Tara in Florida. Tara claimed that her relationship with Chris went beyond friendship, alleging a full-blown affair that started in November 2008. She handed over her phone and laptop to the police, which contained convincing evidence of their romance, including emails, explicit photos, and videos they had exchanged. When confronted with Tara's information, Chris confessed to seeing her more frequently than he initially admitted. Further investigation revealed that Chris and Tara had devised a secret meeting system, often coinciding with his work trips for Joyce Meyer. They would secretly meet at these locations, sometimes traveling to exotic destinations like Hawaii to spend time together away from their families. Chris claimed his relationship with Tara wasn't an affair, defining an affair as involving a deeper level of commitment and involvement than they had. However, detectives found contradictory evidence on Tara's phone and computer, including a calendar marked with a wedding to Chris and scheduled vacations, suggesting she believed he would leave his family for her. This evidence raised suspicions, contradicting Chris's assertion that their relationship was casual. Chris's father, Ronald, was shocked by the revelation, but insisted that the affair had no connection to the murders of Chris's wife and son. He described Chris as gentle and non-violent, emphasizing that he showed no signs of aggression. Detectives suspected Chris's affair with Tara was a strong motive for the murders, but their initial investigation found insufficient evidence to press charges. After 6 hours of questioning, Chris was released without charges. Tara was identified as a person of interest in the murders of Sherry Garrett and Gavin. However, detectives cleared her as a suspect after determining she was in Florida on the morning of May 5, 2009, when the family was killed. The Coleman family murders led to one of the largest murder investigations in Illinois history. A task force of 25 detectives was formed to catch the killer. For 15 consecutive days, they worked 20-hour shifts, bringing in experts to assist with the case. A key focus of the task force was tracing the source of the hate-filled emails sent to Chris Coleman. Every threatening email received by Joyce Meyer Ministries in the past year was carefully analyzed, leading the team to locations across the country. Each person who emailed Joyce Meyer was tracked down and interviewed, but none of the individuals who sent those threats seemed to be responsible for the Coleman family's murder. A computer forensic team was called in to investigate the murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin. The detectives wanted to find any digital clues related to the crime, so they began by analyzing the email account diarist@gmail.com. Their analysis revealed that the email address was created on November 14, 2008, just days before the first email was sent. One of the most significant discoveries made by the team was that the death threat sent to Chris Coleman's family had originated from the same IP address associated with Chris himself. The detectives continued their investigation into the Coleman family's murder by conducting a thorough examination of both the spray-painted messages found at the crime scene and Christopher Coleman's handwriting to gather evidence. They took photographs of the spray-painted messages at the crime scene and collected samples of Christopher Coleman's handwriting. These samples were then sent to a handwriting expert for analysis. After comparing the two samples, the expert concluded that the handwriting matched the spray-painted messages. This finding led the detectives to conclude that Christopher Coleman was the one who wrote the messages on the walls of his home on the day of the murders. A chemical analysis of the spray paint used at the crime scene identified the brand and color as Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red. Investigators learned that Chris Coleman had bought this exact product at a local hardware store just days before his family was killed. One detective contacted the store manager, who confirmed the purchase and identified the specific product as Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red spray paint. This crucial discovery linked Chris Coleman to the same type of spray paint found at the murder scene. During the investigation into the Coleman family's murder, the time of death became a crucial factor. Initially, Chris claimed to have left his home around 5:45 a.m. on May 5, 2009, the morning his family was killed. However, the medical examiner's report showed that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin were killed around 3 a.m., indicating that Chris was at home when his family was murdered. 2 weeks after the bodies were discovered, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution's argument was that the murders were motivated by greed, selfishness, and narcissism, and that Chris had decided to eliminate his family to start anew. In April 2011, Chris Coleman's trial began, with the state accusing him of murdering his wife, Sherry, and their 2 sons, Garrett and Gavin. The prosecution's case was that Chris had killed his family because he wanted to be with Tara Lynn, but couldn't divorce his wife due to the potential loss of his well-paying job with Joyce Meyer Ministries, which did not condone divorce. Conversely, Chris's defense attorney argued that Chris was innocent and that an intruder had entered the home on May 5, 2009, and committed the murders. Exactly 2 years after the devastating murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, Chris Coleman was finally found guilty of the heinous crime. Although eligible for the death penalty, the judge instead sentenced Chris to life imprisonment without parole. This verdict was influenced by the state of Illinois' recent repeal of the death penalty, which was set to take effect just months after the tragic incident. Sherry's loved ones and friends were resolute in keeping her, Garrett, and Gavin's memories alive and sought to do something meaningful to honor them. They decided to raise funds for victims of domestic violence, a cause that deeply resonated with them. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Jassy Correa. In 2019, Jassy Correa, a 22-year-old woman, had planned to celebrate her 23rd birthday with friends at an entertainment venue in Boston. However, she never returned home after their meeting. Her disappearance made headlines on many American TV channels. Born in the U.S., Jassy moved to Massachusetts with her father when she was 3. She grew up in Dorchester, Boston, and later became a loving mother to her daughter, Gabriella. Despite her tough personal life, Jessy's love for her family, friends, and daughter remained unwavering. About a year before her disappearance, her partner, Miguel Castro, who was Gabriella's father, attacked her. Jassy wanted to leave him, but Miguel refused to let her go, beating her severely instead. She eventually reported the incident to the police, and the court sentenced Miguel to 4 years in prison. Jassy worked as a waitress at Del Frisco, a Boston restaurant. She had a passion for dancing and photography. The young mother cherished her time with her loved ones, often taking her daughter to the park. On the evening of Saturday, February 23, 2019, Jassy left her 2-year-old daughter with her family to celebrate her birthday with friends at Vivano, a nightclub in Boston's Theater District on Warrington Street. She wore her new orange jumpsuit and enjoyed herself. A few days later, her friend told the police that they had spent the night dancing and drinking champagne at the club. After it closed, Jassy and her 2 friends stepped outside. However, they eventually went their separate ways, leaving Jassy alone. She failed to return home that night, and her phone was turned off, with all calls going straight to voicemail. There was no news from Jassy on Sunday or Monday. In fact, no one had seen her since she left the nightclub early Sunday morning. Concerned, her father Wen Korea, accompanied by one of Jassy's friends, reported her disappearance to the police on Tuesday, February 26th. The police subsequently launched an investigation into her disappearance. The detectives' first priority was to establish where Jassy went after leaving the nightclub. Her family and friends handed out information flyers to pedestrians and around the city, hoping someone would come forward with valuable information. The detectives questioned Jassy's friends who were with her that night, but this didn't yield much progress in the investigation since they didn't know where she had gone after leaving the club. They bid each other farewell, and Jassy planned to head home. The police spoke to witnesses and analyzed CCTV footage from cameras inside the club and on nearby streets. One recording showed Jassy on the sidewalk on Tremont Street near the nightclub at 2:14 a.m., where she interacted with several people. This was after she left the nightclub. The footage also revealed Jassy, who appeared to be intoxicated, getting into an Uber she hadn't ordered. The young woman mistakenly entered the wrong car, which prompted an argument with the driver, who eventually pushed her out of the vehicle. What caught the investigators' attention next was the following incident. After being kicked out of the car, the girl continued to argue with the driver. At this point, a stranger approached her and took her hand. He led her a short distance away, and they began discussing something. It seemed she wanted to leave, but the man wouldn't release her hand. On the recording, they can be seen standing on the sidewalk, and the man, still holding Jassy's hands, pulled her towards him. A closer look at the CCTV footage revealed that Jassy left the area with this man. Knowing how the story unfolded, it's clear she fell prey to an opportunist who took advantage of the situation. Further CCTV footage showed Jassy jumped onto the man's back, and he carried her to his car. They then got into the vehicle and drove away. 14 minutes later, the police faced a multitude of unanswered questions. Who was the man who had taken Jassy, and where had he gone? Fortunately, they were able to rapidly identify the man's name and address. The individual with whom Jassy was last seen was revealed to be 32-year-old Louis Coleman. Having grown up in a reputable family, Coleman had, according to certain sources, obtained a master's degree in physics and had no prior run-ins with the law. A search of the police database yielded no evidence that Coleman owned a vehicle. However, his mother, a California resident, possessed a red 2016 Buick, which was the exact make and model of car in which Coleman had placed Jassy. Coleman lived in Providence, Rhode Island, roughly 50 miles from the Vivano nightclub. When the police arrived at his home, they found he was no longer there. CCTV footage from inside and outside the building confirmed the police's and Jassy's family's worst fears. The drive from the Vivano club to Coleman's apartment in Providence typically takes about an hour, which suggests he made a stop somewhere. He returned to his apartment on Sunday at 4:15 a.m., approximately 2 hours after he had put Jassy in his car. The next day, Coleman sent an email to his colleagues, informing them he would be away for a few more days. Based on his email, it appears he needed time to cover his tracks after the crime, which is exactly what he attempted to do over the next 2 days. We will now examine additional CCTV footage to understand what happened to Jassy after she left with Coleman. Although the police never released the initial recording due to ethical reasons, it showed Coleman entering his apartment with Jassy. The lobby CCTV footage reveals that at around 4:27 a.m., Coleman carried a woman, who was either unconscious or already deceased, into the building, and then got into the elevator and went up to the 6th floor. On Tuesday, February 26th, the same day Jassy's father reported her disappearance to the police, Coleman was caught on cameras at Walmart. The list of goods he purchased was very telling. The receipts obtained by the police indicated that he had bought various items, including 3 Tyvek suits, duct tape, 2 candles, electrical tape, a mask, surgical gloves, 2 pairs of safety goggles, a respirator, and the CLN release bleach bath. On February 27th, while family and friends handed out flyers with Jassy's photo to people walking by, Coleman returned to Walmart. Security footage from 9:22 p.m. shows him pushing a cart containing some distinctive items. This time he purchased a large suitcase and a canister. Later that evening, at around 9:58 p.m., Coleman was seen on video entering his apartment building with what appeared to be a new large suitcase. The next footage, taken on February 28th at 2:15 a.m., shows Coleman wheeling the suitcase out of his apartment towards the elevator and into the parking lot, where he loaded it into his vehicle. The footage speaks for itself. Coleman struggled to lift a suitcase into his car trunk. Over a period of about an hour and a half, from 2:44 a.m. to 4:02 a.m., Coleman allegedly made multiple trips out of the building, each time carrying various items, including cardboard boxes, trash bags, a bottle of bleach, a computer tower, a black laptop case, and a small duffel bag. Jassy Correa has been missing from Coleman's apartment since the morning of February 24th. Later, on February 28, 2019, U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts, Andrew Lelling, informed reporters that a search warrant had been obtained for Coleman's apartment. The search yielded 2 packages of hooded coveralls and 2 respirator masks. Additionally, investigators examined a sofa with 4 large cushions, one of which was missing its cover. Outside the apartment complex, investigators discovered a dumpster containing various items, including white trash bags, a bag of plastic sheets, a pair of men's jeans with bleach stains and a belt, a white nylon hooded coverall, an empty box of baking soda, clear safety goggles, duct tape packaging, rubbing alcohol, Walmart bags, used plastic gloves, an empty package from a car air freshener, 3 used packages of purifying charcoal, and a sponge. On February 28, 2019, police officers pulled over Coleman's car near Wilmington, Delaware, in the afternoon. They ordered him out of the vehicle and asked if anyone else was with him. According to some sources, Coleman responded that she was in the trunk of the vehicle. Upon searching the car, officers found Jassy's body wrapped in a sofa cushion cover, which was inside a black trash bag contained within a large suitcase that matched the one Coleman had brought into his apartment the previous day, February 27, 2019. Following an examination of the car, experts discovered cracks on the passenger side of the windshield, suggesting to the police that the man had assaulted Jassy inside the vehicle. Coleman was subsequently arrested and taken to a Delaware State Police barracks, where a large bandage covered the right side of his face. When questioned about the bandage, he allegedly attributed it to the girl. A forensic investigation revealed that Jassy's cause of death was strangulation and blunt force trauma. Seminal fluid was found on her body, and DNA analysis matched it to Coleman's. Although the exact location of Jassy's death remains unknown, experts speculate that it could have occurred either in the car or at Coleman's apartment. Jassy's sudden death came as a shock to her family, leaving her 2-year-old daughter motherless. Following her death, representatives from the Boston authorities visited the Correa family, promising to seek justice for Jass. On Saturday, March 9, 2019, members of Jassy's grieving family and community gathered at St. Peter's Parish in Dorchester to bid her farewell. Many wore all-white attire, while others wore buttons, shirts, and sweatshirts bearing Jassie's face and the phrase, "Justice for Jassie." Jassie's cousin and best friend, Maka Andrade, delivered a heartfelt eulogy conveying the family's sorrow and trust in God. Boston Mayor Marty Walsh spoke, pledging to work towards creating a safer world for women, where young women can go out at night, celebrate their birthdays with friends, and return home safely to their children and families. No family should ever have to endure what Jassie's family has gone through. When Correa, Jassie's father, thanked the crowd of over 200 people gathered at the church, Jassie's mother, who lived in Portugal and had not seen her daughter in 20 years, was also in attendance. The grief-stricken parents prepared to lay their 23-year-old daughter to rest. The church was packed, with people lining the back wall. When Correa expressed gratitude to the city for its support and to the law enforcement agencies and departments from 3 states that had dedicated considerable resources to their mission, he bid a final farewell, saying, "Rest in paradise, my dear Jass. Rest in peace, my dear child." Louis Coleman faced a charge of kidnapping resulting in death, which could have led to the death penalty or a life sentence. However, in November 2019, prosecutors announced that they would not seek capital punishment. During the trial, prosecutors presented various pieces of evidence, including a video showing Coleman dragging Jassie Correa's body into his apartment in Providence and his online search history in the days following her disappearance. The FBI agents testified about Coleman's online searches, which included queries like, "Can a person fit in a suitcase?" and "How to pull a tooth out that is not loose." Coleman's legal team argued that the evidence presented by the prosecution had little to no relevance to the kidnapping charge against him. They claimed that the prosecution's evidence primarily focused on Coleman's actions after Correa's death, which were illegal or inappropriate, but did not prove the kidnapping allegation. As attorney David H. stated, "None of these things are determinant of the elements of the kidnapping allegation." Motions filed by both the prosecution and defense provide a detailed account of the events surrounding Jassie Correa's disappearance and the subsequent discovery of her lifeless body. While the two sides present differing narratives, the documents reveal chilling details about the tragic events that unfolded and the circumstances leading to Jassie's death. Prosecutors established that Coleman was present at the same nightclub as Jassie and her friends. Within the club, he socialized with a woman he had just met, engaging in conversation, dancing, and even exchanging phone numbers. The two individuals texted each other while still at the club and continued to do so after its closure. Prosecutors and the defense team presented two opposing viewpoints. According to prosecutors, Jassie was not the aggressor, and Coleman took her life after deceiving her into thinking he would drive her to her friend's apartment. In contrast, the defense team claimed that Jassie acted aggressively towards Coleman after being pushed out of the Uber driver's car. During the trial, defense attorneys attempted to establish that Jassie initiated the fight with Coleman on her own accord and that the crime was a spontaneous altercation rather than a premeditated act of stalking, kidnapping, and murder. Prosecutors argued that the defendant's main claim is that the 119-pound victim attacked the 200-pound defendant. However, Coleman's lawyers downplayed their client's role in the crime. Toxicology results revealed that, in addition to alcohol, Jassie's body contained traces of multiple illegal substances. Despite being convicted of kidnapping resulting in death in June 2022, Coleman's defense team filed a new motion claiming insufficient evidence. However, the motion was unsuccessful. In October 2022, 36-year-old Louis Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without parole for kidnapping and murdering Jassie Correa. The court also ordered him to pay her family $60,000 in compensation. Louis Coleman, a stranger to Jassie Correa, kidnapped, raped, and strangled her to death. The immense pain and suffering he inflicted on Jassie and her loved ones, including her mother, father, brother, and many others, has persisted every day since February 24, 2019. This sentence cannot alleviate their suffering. First Assistant United States Attorney Joshua Levy stated, "By his monstrous actions and callous disregard for Jossie's life, Louis Coleman surrendered his right to freedom in society." To this day, Louis Coleman has shown no remorse for luring the 22-year-old into his car, sexually assaulting her, and brutally killing her. Rather than turning himself in, he devised a gruesome plan to hide the assault and murder. Hello friends. Welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Andrea Lohaugen. Andrea Lohaugen, born on January 6, 1977, in Bad Big, grew up in a close-knit family in a new residential complex. Known for her obedience and excellence in studies from a young age, she became a source of pride for her parents. By the age of 16, Andrea had blossomed into a beautiful school star with many admirers. Apart from studying and attending parties, the girls did not engage in anything reprehensible. On October 7, 1993, the day before the end of 16-year-old Andrea's autumn break, she was out shopping with her parents near their home. She was nearing the end of her high school journey, looking ahead to her final year, exams, and the transition into adult life. Andrea dreamt of going to university, building a career, and starting a family. With just one more year of schooling left, the future looked bright. One day, Andrea was supposed to return from the club around 10 p.m. to make it in time for watching another horror movie, which she was accustomed to watching in the evenings with her mother. However, at the appointed hour, the beauty did not show up at home. Initially, it was assumed that Andrea would be delayed for a couple of hours with friends and then return as usual. But her friends at the party never saw the girl, which greatly alarmed them. Such an uncharacteristic delay for responsible Andrea did not align with her usual punctual behavior. She had never allowed herself to be late before. The next day, when Andrea didn't show up at school, her parents got really worried. They decided to search for her, asking the father to help. At 1:30 a.m., they set off in their car to look for Andrea. Despite searching for hours in Bad Belzig and checking the youth center, they couldn't find any leads. When they went to the youth center, Andrea's friends couldn't say if she had left for the club or gone back home. By around 4 a.m., the parents went to the local police to report Andrea's disappearance. Unfortunately, the police were hesitant to start searching for her immediately. They believed she had just gone out and would come home the next morning. But Andrea's parents were sure something terrible had happened to her. They knew she wouldn't run away or not come home on her own, especially as all her belongings were still at home. The police only started investigating a week later, when Andrea still hadn't returned. Up until then, her parents had been searching everywhere in town. They even checked with all the hospitals in the area, but didn't find any news about a girl who looked like Andrea. Andrea was last seen before her disappearance. Her parents suspected her ex-boyfriend, thinking he might have something to do with it. The police decided to investigate the lead provided by the parents, and after questioning witnesses from the youth club where Andrea was supposed to go, it was revealed that she never showed up at the club. Her friends, who were waiting for her, confirmed her absence. The club underwent thorough searches by patrols, search and rescue teams with trained dogs, and numerous volunteers, but Andrea's whereabouts remained unknown. Public appeals were made for information, cautioning against potential dangers. Despite exhaustive efforts including press conferences, TV broadcasts, and investigation, no substantial leads emerged. Investigators managed to reconstruct events leading up to Andrea's disappearance on October 7, 1993. Speculations arose about the possibility of sexual assault due to Andrea's appearance. Detectives scrutinized her acquaintances, listing ex-boyfriends and admirers in search of clues. After a thorough investigation, it was found that all potential suspects had solid alibis. Many young men at the party couldn't have been involved in the attack. However, the surveillance system was still in its early stages, which made the investigation more complicated. Detectives then searched for possible witnesses to the incident. They found that Andrea took a shorter route to the club that evening, and several witnesses saw her. These witnesses mentioned that she passed by a group of young people and later by a couple of teenagers whom she did not know well. Andrea continued on her way, and the last people to see her alive were two boys, aged 13 and 14, named Robin and David. According to German law, their identities and photos could not be revealed. The detectives found these teenagers and took their statements. It turned out they just nodded to the girl and went their separate ways. After that, Andrea seemed to vanish without a trace. The police concentrated on Robin and David, the last people known to have seen Andrea alive. Growing up near the Hogan family's home and coming from troubled families, the teens were familiar with the side path Andrea took. It was a common route for them, despite their young age. Despite the boys having a history of minor thefts and break-ins, there was insufficient evidence to charge them with serious crimes like assault and abduction. Eventually, all suspicions against them were cleared because they were minors, and the case reached a standstill. For the next 7 years, the situation remained unresolved. On July 7, 2000, a local resident discovered a human skull while walking his dog. Initially mistaking it for a ball, he later realized it was a genuine human skull, long devoid of flesh and with a hole pierced through the occipital bone. The resident reported the find to the police. Detectives found a complete human skeleton buried on the former boyfriend's property, identified as Andrea Lo Hagen. Despite the absence of her clothing, forensic examination, including dental records, confirmed the remains belonged to Andrea, who had been missing for 7 years. The tragic truth was uncovered next to the youth center where Andrea was heading. On that evening, her remains were discovered by the investigation, revealing the grim truth about the girl's fate. Relatives were able to give her a proper burial. However, questions arose about the thoroughness of the initial searches. The body had been hidden right under their noses all these years. Reviewing the search operation reports showed that the area, including the abandoned shed with piles of debris, had been inspected by investigators before. Nothing suspicious was found inside. It's possible that the victim's body was hidden there much later, although there was no documentary evidence to confirm this. Detectives recalled testimonies of witnesses who mentioned the last time Andrea was seen was with two teenagers aged 13 and 14, Robin and David. Soon after meeting them, the girl disappeared without a trace, raising suspicions in the investigation. During the initial inquiry, the boys were interrogated again and claimed they had only greeted Andrea that fateful night and had no connection to her disappearance. Unfortunately, no evidence or traces linking the suspects to the victim were found during the inspection of the shed and the forensic examination. Despite this, all signs pointed to the boys, and their involvement couldn't be completely ruled out. Upon closer examination, it was found that these teenagers had a definite link to the spot where Andrea's body was discovered. People frequently saw Robin and David close to the shed. It was also uncovered that the boys could enter the inside of the vacant building. Witnesses stated that on the night the girl went missing, the teenagers were spotted at the entrance of the shed. This raised new questions and intensified suspicions of their involvement in the crime. Despite the link to the crime scene, authorities couldn't ignore the connection of the teenagers, Robin and David, to the crime scene. The investigation into their involvement ceased at that time. The primary argument was the lack of sufficient evidence and the young age of the potential suspects. This led the detectives to not believe in the schoolboys' involvement in the murder. In 2012, new leadership in the regional police department renewed interest in Andrea Lo Hagen's cold case. During the reopened investigation, detectives uncovered some new evidence and leads, but there was still not enough proof to charge a specific individual. There was no prime suspect in sight. The situation changed dramatically in May 2016 when 37-year-old David passed away in Berlin. He was one of the teenagers who had last seen Andrea alive. David's cause of death was serious pancreatic problems due to drug addiction and an antisocial lifestyle. During one of his train trips, David suffered a fatal internal hemorrhage. Even though the death certificate listed natural causes, he had a long criminal history. A witness came forward to law enforcement claiming to solve Andrea Lohagen's murder case, revealing details only they knew. This witness turned out to be David's mother, who confessed to keeping a terrible secret about her son's involvement in the brutal murder of the local beauty. One October evening in 1993, David and his friend Robin were walking along a path when they encountered Andrea. Noticing her fashionable attire, the delinquent youth decided to attack and rob the 16-year-old girl in the darkness. Robin was immediately brought in for questioning. By that time, his former accomplice was no longer alive, so the police had to rely solely on the words of the surviving criminal. Robin, relieved, confessed to everything, recounting the gruesome details. He expressed a desire to first speak with his family, confess to them, and only then provide final testimony to the investigation. Appreciating the testimony of the key witness, the detectives agreed to give Robin 48 hours to meet with his family. They had no inkling that the 36-year-old man had already made up his mind. Upon returning to his apartment, where his wife was temporarily absent, Robin left a final message for his wife and a note for the police detailing the attack on Andrea Lohagen. Then he disappeared without a trace. 2 days later, with Robin failing to show up, he was declared missing. On November 4, 2016, the body of the sought-after man was discovered by one of the hunters in the mountains. The mutilated body of the 36-year-old man lay at the bottom of a deep ravine. Robin had voluntarily ended his life, apparently unable to bear the burden of guilt for the crime he committed in his youth. In his final note, Robin described the horrifying details of that senseless crime, admitting he himself never understood the true motives of his friend David. David initiated the attack without explaining to his friend why he suddenly decided to assault a girl. Robin detailed the incident, noting that the killer confessed to not knowing the victim, Andrea Lohagen, before the attack. The assault was a sudden outburst of aggression as the teenagers crossed paths with Andrea on her way to a party. After exchanging greetings, David unexpectedly attacked the girl. The teenagers then buried her body in an outbuilding before fleeing. There was no apparent motive for the attack, described as senseless cruelty. Robin revealed their past involvement with drug dealers and drug use that night. Peter Lemon, head of the youth center Andrea frequented, was shocked by the violence. He cooperated with the investigation, recalling the victim as a well-behaved regular at the establishment. Lemon was aware of rumors about 2 teenagers near the scene, but never suspected them capable of such a crime. These individuals had been free for 20 years after committing murder. The investigation did not have any direct evidence like DNA or fingerprints to link the suspects to the crime. Detectives looked into Robin's social media activity and device content for any signs of involvement in the crime. Suspicious posts suggesting David's connection to Andrea's disappearance were found on his accounts, indicating he might have known about the investigation. David's mother believed his death was fate, as she was worried about his criminal past and involvement with the police. The violent content on David's social media raised concerns about his capability for cruelty at a young age. There were concerns about a possible third adult accomplice in Andrea's murder, possibly an elder mentor guiding the young boys. Andrea's death was caused by a severe head injury, indicating the need for significant physical strength. The detectives were skeptical that 2 teenagers of that age could have used enough force to overpower an older girl and cause such a serious injury. The idea of an adult accomplice was indirectly supported by other details uncovered during the investigation. At that time, a new potential suspect emerged for the detectives. It was a man closely associated with Robin and David's company and significantly older than them. However, the investigators didn't disclose this man's name, neither in the pre-death note nor in Robin's testimony. Moreover, David's mother denied the possibility of a third accomplice. Despite this, some indirect witness testimonies pointed to the involvement of an outsider adult. For instance, witnesses described a truck driver of approximately the same age whom they saw near the shed around the time Andrea disappeared. The identity of this person was established, and the investigators directly linked him to the incident surrounding the girl's disappearance. In reality, all three teenagers, Andrea, Robin, and David, attended the same school. However, due to the age difference, they didn't cross paths in the same classes, nor did they have common activities or friends. It couldn't be ruled out that there were previous conflicts between Andrea and the juvenile delinquents living nearby, perhaps fueling the embittered teenagers' hateful feelings towards the girl. Both boys grew up in troubled families, which led to early exposure to alcohol and illicit substances. It's possible that on that fateful night, they were also under the influence of intoxicating substances, heightening their unrestrained aggressiveness. One striking detail was that Andrea's remains were discovered on a plot belonging to a relative of one of the killers, the grandfather of the victim's former boyfriend. Some considered this too specific a coincidence and speculated on the involvement of the ex-boyfriend in the incident. The public expressed strong disapproval when the truth about the teenager's role in the murder was revealed. People were upset that in the 1990s, detectives had stopped the investigation because the potential suspects were young in the small town of Bad Big, where everyone knew each other. Previously, school children were suspected of being involved in Andrea's disappearance due to rumors and dissatisfaction from neighbors. David's family had to move away after the tragedy. If the detectives had continued focusing on the teenagers back then, the victim's body would have been discovered much sooner, allowing for a prompt evaluation of their crime and holding the young killers accountable in a timely manner. Post-mortem results showed a fracture in Andrea's skull, but the specific object used to cause the injury couldn't be identified. The investigation only had the small bones of the decomposed skeleton to rely on. With no direct physical evidence, they had to depend on David's mother's testimonies and Robin's notes. When the investigation was reopened, a crucial question arose. Did these juvenile criminals commit any new crimes while free over the last 20-plus years? It seemed unlikely, but the chance couldn't be discounted. Local residents couldn't recall any new serious incidents involving them, but David and Robin had a history of minor criminal activities that detectives thoroughly investigated. This scrutiny revealed dark secrets of the teenage group. By the time suspicions emerged about Robin's involvement in a new serious incident, the detectives learned of the horrifying events on January 11, 2014. A French exchange student named Louise went missing after meeting friends at the university hospital. Just before leaving home, she had a phone conversation with a friend to plan their meetup. However, Louise never arrived at the agreed location. Her friends tried to contact her, but she didn't answer her phone. They assumed she must have had urgent matters and went home. The next day, Louise didn't show up for work without any explanation, which was unusual for her because she was known to be very responsible. Her phone was unreachable in the evening, and her whereabouts were unknown. Later, Louise's body was found. The main suspect in her murder turned out to be Robin, the same juvenile killer who had taken his own life just as the police were reopening his old case. The coincidence was truly ominous. It was revealed that Louise personally knew Robin. The French girl had no idea about the dangerous person she had gotten involved with, and sadly she paid with her life, likely becoming the second victim of the ruthless criminal. However, just like in Andrea's case, proving Robin's involvement in Louise's murder was extremely challenging because the investigation lacked sufficient direct evidence. The case of the French student's murder officially remained unsolved. Many believed that the root of evil lay in the negligence of the law enforcement officers who had halted the investigation into the involvement of the two juvenile teenagers in Andrea's murder back in 1993 due to their underage status. This negligence allowed future criminals to commit new crimes with a high degree of probability. Robin did kill Louise, as his criminal past had been neglected, leading to unsuccessful searches, with the case gathering dust on distant archival shelves. Andrea's body had decomposed in plain sight, and years later, Louise met a similar fate, a life that could have been saved so easily. The Lohaugen family believes that the juvenile killers did not receive their deserved punishment for their crimes, as they lived freely for a significant period before their deaths. During that time, nothing prevented them from leading normal lives, carrying out simple everyday tasks, the very joys that innocent Andrea was cruelly deprived of. The exact motives for her murder, like many other details of that ancient tragedy, remain shrouded in mystery to this day, behind the 7 locks of unproven facts and silence. This case underscores how dangerous it is to underestimate the criminal potential even of the youngest suspects, and the negligence of the investigation that disregarded leads solely because of Robin and David's minority. In 1993, 2 juvenile killers were able to nurture their violent tendencies and avoid facing justice for several years. The extreme cruelty demonstrated by these teenagers during the random murder of Andrea, a passerby, continues to shock people. Even some adult criminals are incapable of such senseless and inhumane aggression, yet the culprits turned out to be immature youths. It is chilling to think about what Robin and David could have become if their criminal activities had not been stopped. The belated revelation of the truth about Andrea's murder highlights the importance of solving crimes before it's too late, as eventually the truth will emerge. However, restoring justice may prove impossible by that time. Andrea's tragic story reminds us of the value of every human life. All that remains is to show sympathy and support for Andrea's grieving family. Unfortunately, justice was never fully served, as Robin and David never faced a clear legal judgment, having taken their own lives. Their actions make us realize the horrors even a young person is capable of when stepping onto the destructive path of crime. Corpus Christi resident Kevin Davis strangled his mother before hitting her in the head with a hammer, splitting her skull. Davis then swirled her brain around before sexually assaulting her corpse. Davis was sentenced to life in prison for the crime of a mom who he described as the best. In 2014, Kevin Jasril Davis argued with his mother, 50-year-old Kimberly Hill, in the Corpus Christi, TX, apartment he shared with her and his sister, Destiny. On May 26th, Davis called 911, reporting that he'd just murdered his mother. Once at the police station, an 18-year-old Davis vividly detailed the day's events, sometimes with a smirk on his face. What he told detectives was gruesome and shocking. Kevin admitted bashing in Hill's head with a hammer, swirling her brain around, and then sexually assaulting her corpse. On the morning of March 27, 2014, Davis, bored and frustrated with life, told his mother he did not like people and that he wanted to commit suicide. Obviously caught off guard by the statement, Hill allegedly told her son that she could not stop him, that was what he wanted to do. Kevin later told police hearing this from his mother enraged him. It was then he decided to take her life. As Hill sat on the couch in the living room, Davis came up behind her, attempting to strangle her with a cord. Hill began screaming. Kevin panicked, retrieved a hammer, and began bashing in his mother's skull. Davis struck his mother in the head with the hammer at least 20 times, splitting her skull in the process. Davis then retrieved a kitchen knife that he inserted inside his mother's head wound. He swirled her brain around to make sure she was dead, Kevin claimed, and then inserted his hand inside the wound. He would tell detectives during a taped interrogation that his mother's brain felt like putty. Kevin then dragged his mother's lifeless body to her bedroom and raped her corpse. When he finished the sadistic act, he went to a neighbor's house, saying he just killed someone and needed help. The neighbor dialed 911. Police arrested Davis without incident. At the police station, he made a full confession of the crime, giving details that even seasoned detectives found highly disturbing. Watch part of Kevin Davis's confession. During the interrogation, Davis told detectives that he originally planned on killing his sister, too, but changed his mind. He further admitted that he often fantasized about having sex with dead bodies. With a smirk on his face, Kevin also told the detective that he was a virgin before he raped his mother. He stated, "I guess I've lost my virginity to a corpse," as he gently laughed. What did Kimberly Hill do to warrant such a violent death? Nothing more into son murdering than sexually assaulting his mother, of course, and Kevin could not give detectives one good reason for the crime. According to Kevin, she was a great mom that did not deserve what he had done to her. He said that she was the best mother in the world, and went on to say, "I am a terrible, disgusting person." Kevin admitted that he had the best mother in the world, telling detectives that she did nothing to deserve what was done to her. He went on to say that he was a terrible, disgusting person. In reality, Kevin was a serial killer in the making, a psychopath who took sadistic pleasure in hurting other people. Although diagnosed by a psychologist with antisocial personality disorder, the doctor said he knew right from wrong when he brutally murdered and raped his mother. He readily admitted that he would tell again if ever released from prison. He also confessed to then fleeing the crime scene on his bicycle. Before he did that, though, he left several handwritten notes for the police, one of which read, "Chase me. Sorry for the mess. KD." But, after a while, he decided against leaving town and called 911 to report his mother's killing and his crimes. Despite admitting to the murder and making a videotaped confession, Kevin Davis pleaded not guilty to the charges in court. He later changed the plea. Davis smiled at the jury as they sentenced him to life in prison. He serves his time at the Jester 4 facility in Richmond, Texas, and is eligible for parole in March 2044. Story number 2. Story of the Killer Priest. We will be exploring the story of a killer. A priest that seemed to be normal, nothing strange or nothing weird about him, however, he did have a dark side. It turns out that not only was he a pervert, but he was manipulating people as he saw fit, especially women, and now without further ado, let's dive into the story of Guy Desnoyers. We're going back in time in the 50s in France, and we need to take note that the church at that time had a very important place in people's lives, especially in the countryside. The priests were almost as important as the mayors because they were representing a type of moral authority that many people listened to, and this was the case in the small village of Europe where this story took place. A town that had about 400 villagers. Guy Desnoyers was born on the countryside, and his family was very Catholic. They raised him so that he can have a career in religion as a priest, and even if that was not his first choice, that is exactly what he became. It is in 1950 that Guy became a priest at the Church of Europe. In appearance, this young man looked like the ideal priest. He was nice, friendly, kind, and very dynamic. Anything linked to religion, he did it very, very well. He had a lot of great ideas to help the village grow. He created a choir, a group to play in a theater piece. He had organized multiple excursions for the kids, and he was known to have created a soccer team for the boys of the village. The older people thought that it was very modern for him to bring all these items to the village, and the younger generation thought it was pretty amazing and appreciated the modern aspect that he brought to the town and to the religion. Desnoyers was apparently also a beautiful man, and the ladies found him very charming. Now, as I have mentioned at the beginning, underneath this whole angelic disguise, Guy was actually hiding a dark secret, his personality. He had a thirst for carnal pleasure, and he was using his charm to get closer to the ladies. After a lot of perversity and manipulation, a lot of the women actually gave in, and none of the women spoke as they were afraid that no one would believe them and did not want to be seen as the shame of the village. It is in 1953 that things took a different turn for Guy Desnoyers. An incident happened that changed the plan of the priest. A 16-year-old girl fell for his charm, and guess what happened? She became pregnant. Now, of course, the priest denies everything, and he says that he is not the father. He threatens the girl and says that if she does not stop, he will file a complaint for defamation. Now, having an eye influence in the village, Guy says that this is nonsense and it is impossible for him to be the father, and of course, having such an high influence, his followers believed him. He was even summoned in front of his superior, the bishop, to which he lied to you and denied the whole thing, and of course, this whole situation was shut down. In reality, he was actually the father, and he actually took the girl to another village to give birth, where he convinced her to give away the child, and of course that story was never heard of or told to the villagers, or, we could say, maybe presume, that if people knew, they decided not to say anything because the priest had such a high influence on the villagers that they did not want to go against him. Once the story died, Gan went back to his normal ways and kept manipulating the people like he did before, but there was another incident in 1956. Regine Fays, 19 years of age, got pregnant and again by Guy de Noyer. Contrary to the other women, Regine did not want to give away her child for adoption. Not only that, but she wanted to raise him in the village of the Europe where the priest was. Guy was terrified, and he was afraid that eventually the child would grow up and resemble him. He was also afraid that this woman would actually speak eventually. Speaking of which, in 1956 rumors started to make surface. A lot of parishioners were becoming pregnant in mysterious ways, and no one knew who the father was. The priest then starts to think about a plan, and asks a military man from another village to come to town and pretend that he was the father. Unfortunately, that strategy did not work out, and no one believed the soldier was the father. That only made things worse for the mysterious pregnancies. December 3rd, 1956 is a date that changed everything for the priest. Guy brings Regine in on a deserted road to try and convince her one more time to give up the child. She refuses again, and she was tired of the priest's requests, so you know what she did? She got out of the car and started to walk back the opposite way back to the village. At night, Guy de Noyer got out of the car and pulled out a 6.35 caliber pistol and fired 3 shots. The 3 shot hit Regine in the back of the neck, then she died on the spot. Once the crime committed, the priest walked to the victim, undressed her, and took out a knife and started to open Regine's stomach. From her stomach, he removed the baby girl that was still alive. The priest committed again an act that cannot be forgiven. He strangled the baby, stabbed it, disfigured it, and he did all the thinking to himself that, if the baby is massacred that way, there would be no way, no DNA, if you want to call it that way, no DNA to trace the baby back to. The disappearance of Regine was actually reported in the evening, and the weird part is that the priest joined the search party to find Regine. Can you imagine that situation? I mean, the killer is with you in the search party trying to find the person that he just murdered. Is it just me, or that is just like Twisted? The body was found very quickly, and because the priest was now an assassin, he didn't, think about cleaning up the crime scene, so it didn't take long for the cops to find the murder weapon, and they found the weapon casing that linked back to the priest. So the priest is now a suspect, and when asked during the interrogation, the priest denied everything. However, because of all the pressure he was getting, he just cracked and admitted everything. Now that story came out, and everyone was devastated in France because he is now a criminal, and the church asked for Guy to be locked up with a false name so that it would not affect the church, and also the main reason was to make sure that the crime was not associated to the church. The court addressed the case of Guy de Noyer on January 24, 1958. Of course, the villagers and the public opinion wanted the priest to be sentenced to death. The life of Guy was defined as a person that did enjoy luxury, sexual relations, and admired his own authority, and on his side, the priest was asking forgiveness because he had no clue what he did wrong. The jury did provide their verdict, and for most, they said that he was guilty of double murder. Of course, there was Regine and the baby. However, they did not want to sentence him to death. The jury did not want to send someone associated to the church to the scaffold. The priest Guy de Noyer was therefore sentenced to perpetrated work. Now that situation raised a lot of questions regarding the responsibility of the Catholic Church, and this is still a question that is being asked nowadays, especially for the priests who like other kids, if you know what I mean. There was an investigation that was done, and the report came up saying that the church knew the dark side that he was hiding before he was pronounced priest. His superiors noticed that he did not have a lot of faith, and he was not really a believer in Catholic religion. The investigation did show that before being priest in Europe, he was sent to Plymouth. While he was there, he did have a sexual relation with his parishioner, and instead of removing his status, they just transferred him to another city. Even there, his weakness for women did not stop, as he did have multiple sexual relations. You would think that the church would revoke his status, but instead he was just transferred to Europe, where the church was isolated and his temptations might be lower. But as we have seen, this was not the case. De Noyer was released in 1972. After being detained for 22 years, he was the oldest prisoner of France. Once again, the church came to his help after he was released from prison. He was welcome in a monastery in Brittany, where he stayed there until he died on April 21st, 2010 at 90 years of age. Now we go to story number 3. Family slaughtered at Wellsgrave Provincial Park. The killer stalked the family while he let his violent fantasies run wild. 3 generations of a family left to go camping on August 2nd, 1982. They set up camp in the Wellsgrave Provincial Park, located roughly 120 kilometers north of Kamloops in central British Columbia. They enjoyed several days of quality family time, picking berries during the day and gathering around the fire at night, having no idea that they were being stalked by a killer. Among the campers was grandparents Edith, 59, and George Bentley, aged 66, their daughter Jackie, 41, and son-in-law Bob Johnson, 44. Also the Johnsons' daughters Janet, 13, and Karen, just 11. The Johnsons drove up with their daughters and pitched a tent for the girls. The grandparents brought a truck and camper where the adults would stay. The last anyone heard from the family was on August 6th, when Edith called another daughter. It would not be until August 23rd that the family would first be reported missing. Bob Johnson was due back at work on August 16th, but didn't show. After a week with no word from him, his company filed a missing persons case with the police. In spite of an extensive search, it didn't result in finding any of the family members. The biggest problems were the killer had a head start. With plenty of time to kill, get rid of the victims' bodies, and cover his tracks. The other, maybe even bigger obstacle was, no one knew exactly where the family was camping at. All anyone knew was that the family was camping in the Wellsgrave area, which is massive. They had no idea where to even start, let alone being able to follow a trail to find the family. It would take 3 more weeks and a mushroom picker to find the family. On September 13th, the current discovery of the Johnsons' 1979 Plymouth was found. It had been burned beyond recognition as it set off to the side of a mountainside logging road. The car held the bodies of the 4 adults in the back seat and the 2 young girls in the trunk. The bodies were burnt so thoroughly that when it came time to bury the family, they were all placed together in one child-sized casket. Through a forensic examination of the remains, it was determined they had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm. Locals were able to tell investigators where they had seen the family camped at. An examination of the area would turn up .22 casings, which helped identify the weapon used as a Remington pump-action rifle. What wasn't at the campsite was the truck and camper, the boat, and camping gear brought with the family, or any trace of the family at all. With no suspect in custody or even in sight, the media was pushing for answers. A tip came in that the family's truck and camper had been spotted. The witnesses said it was being driven by 2 French Canadians in central Canada. The media sprang into action, throwing this up as their headline and demanding the killers to be caught. In April, with still no leads, the investigators knew they needed to get creative. They reenacted what they believed was the crime scene for TV cameras and aired it across Canada. The next month, the police drove a replica Ford camper truck to Ontario in Quebec, in an attempt to draw awareness for what people should be looking out for. What it did instead was flood the investigators with over 13,000 tips and sightings of the replica vehicle. The reward was raised from $7,500 to $10,000 for information leading to the truck. None of the tips led to the discovery of the camper and truck. It would be found by sheer luck. 2 forestry employees were working on a logging road and stumbled across it. The camper had sat there on Trophy Mountain for 14 months, only a few kilometers away from the crime scene. The camper was burned out like the car holding the family's bodies. This left the authorities to believe they were looking for someone local to the Wellsgrave area, and not 2 French Canadians as they had been searching for, since it was more likely that a local would know about the logging roads in the area in general. Taking a closer look at the person who lived closest to the crime scene led them back to David William Shearing, 24. They had received a tip about him earlier in the investigation. When they followed up, the tipster had quite a bit to tell them. A year earlier, Shearing had asked him about re-registering a Ford truck and how to repair a hole in its door. This was a tip that the police had never divulged. After finding the truck, it had a bullet hole in the door. After an interrogation by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Shearing confessed. He went so far as reenacting the murders for the detectives. He turned over evidence that he had stolen from the family and the murder weapon, the .22 caliber Remington rifle. The ballistic test would prove that this was the weapon used to kill the family. The same weapon that had been hanging on his wall the very first time the authorities went to ask him about the family, right after they had been reported missing. Maybe it was because his father was a prison guard or his brother was a sheriff. But Shearing wasn't suspected when first interviewed. In his confession, he gave details of how it all happened. He had first noticed the family when he set up camp, fixating on the two young girls. Then over the next few days, he watched their every move. On the night of August 10th, Shearing watched as the adults sat around the campfire and had seen the girls go into their tent for the night. From a distance, he took out the 4 adults with sniper shots. He said he then killed the 2 girls in their tent as they slept. After, he said he loaded all the bodies into the car and moved it to the logging road, then set it on fire with 5 gallons of gasoline. He then cleaned up the campground, removing the family's possessions, including the camper and truck. It would only be later that he'd burned these as he was unable to transfer them into his name. He claimed that he killed the family because he wanted to rob them of their possessions. It wouldn't be until after Shearing was convicted that he gave his full confession of how he had been stalking the family. It was the girls that he fantasized about having sex with that kept him interested. That's why after telling the adults, he kidnapped the girls and took them to his property nearby. There he raped and terrorized them for over a week. On August 16th, the day their father was due back at work, Shearing took Taryn away from her big sister. Once alone, he shot the girl in the back of the head. Janet would be left alive for one more day of torture before she would be killed like her sister. With the girls now dead, he took their bodies to the Johnsons' car where the other family members had been placed. He had actually only hidden the car in some bush. He put the girls in the trunk and got into the driver's seat with the 4 decomposing adult bodies in the back seat, driving it to its final resting place where it would be found by that mushroom picker burned out. David Shearing pled guilty to 6 counts of murder. Shearing was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. The maximum penalty for second-degree murder. This would be the first time that this sentence was handed out in Canadian history. David Shearing, who changed his last name to his mother's maiden name of Ennis, was first eligible for parole in 2008. The National Parole Board ruled against his release, citing that he was still having violent sexual fantasies and had not completed his sex offender treatment program, so he was not ready to be released. Again in 2012, he was turned down for parole, applying again in 2014, but before his hearing, he withdrew his request. The National Parole Board has also been given a petition which has over 15,000 signatures, advocating for the violent offender to never be released. In his own words at one of his parole hearings, David tries to plead for freedom, saying this about himself: "I was very selfish." He is supported by his wife, that he married while in prison, Heather,